I am Shannon Callahan of the Portland Housing Bureau, and I'm joined by Kimberly Branham of Prosper Portland and Andrea Durbin of the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. We are here this morning to share with you the cross-bureau collaborative work of our bureaus, along with the Bureau of PBOT, Bureau of Transportation, and the Parks Bureau. Before we begin, we'd like to thank Chris Warner and Adina Long and all of their teams for their work to put together the culmination of what you're going to hear from us this morning. Can we have the PowerPoint up?
Can we switch the screen? So we'll need the folks running the technology to move to the PowerPoint, please. Thank you. Okay. Do you press the down?
Is there a place that I'm supposed to aim it? There we go. Okay. So the mayor, in his budget guidance to us, asked the bureau directors to develop a proposal to implement equitable community development actions. The vision is, specifically in East Portland, that we want a place where residents and local businesses and community institutions do not fear that improvements to their neighborhood are precursors to development, precursors to displacement. We want to create a city where people have the choice to stay in their neighborhoods, where businesses and cultural institutions can continue to serve Portlanders, and residents or businesses are able to benefit in the shared benefits that infrastructure improvements bring.
So I'm Kimberly Branham with Prosper Portland. As we considered the mayor's direction to develop and the vision that Shannon just expressed, sorry, it shouldn't be this hard, okay. We took a collective assessment of where we have assets as a city on which to build and what challenges still need to be addressed. So we identified a number of strengths. The first is that we do have significant financial tools in tax increment finance districts, and these tools can be tailored to the particular needs of the community. We have impactful stabilization tools and partnerships citywide. That includes the construction excise tax and the housing bond, as well as the Inclusive Business Resource Network, that augment our community development activities both within and outside of tax increment finance districts. We have strong community voices and partners like the East Portland Action Plan, Neighborhood Prosperity Network, Anti-Displacement PDX that are interested in partnering and engaging and helping to lead this work. And we have a number of successful examples of cross-agency collaboration in projects such as the Division Transit Line, where community partners, PBOT, BPS, PHB, Prosper, Metro, and TriMet all worked together to consider both the transportation infrastructure needs as well as residential and commercial stabilization needs. We also identified a number of challenges that we face as we seek to engage this work. And the first is setting shared expectations and priorities given market trends and available resources. So this, in simplified language, is what does success look like, and given our resources, what can we commit to achieve? The second is that we have limited financial tools outside of tax increment finance districts, which are, and these tools are largely focused on physical improvements. We have modest programming funding to stabilize families and businesses, both within and outside of tax increment finance districts. And finally, we have currently no established protocols for aligning community stabilization approaches with infrastructure projects, meaning that we effectively reinvent the wheel every time we have a major infrastructure priority and need to come together to have a comprehensive community development conversation.
So over the next few slides, we're going to talk with you specifically about East Portland and why our efforts are focused in East Portland. As we think of displacement and displacement risk, we know that East Portland is in jeopardy of displacement. But we also know that we have a very unique opportunity to work in East Portland before we face the massive displacement that we saw, for instance, in North and Northeast as a community. We're in the early stages of displacement risk in East Portland, and we think now is the time to hone our tools, our cross-collaborative approach, and start to bring services directly targeting specific neighborhoods in Portland where we're seeing major infrastructure investments. This map that you're seeing in front of you, I'm sure you're very familiar with. It is actually the map that indicates where various stages of displacement are. And as I said, it particularly indicates that East Portland is at risk. It is mostly at an early risk, but we know that we're also updating these maps as we speak right now. And we also know that what we're hearing from folks in the community and seeing in folks in the community is changing very rapidly.
So our teams work together across parks and transportation, planning, housing, and Prosper to identify planned investments in East Portland in the next few years, with an eye towards identifying projects that might send signals to the market and where we can engage together to support the community at its beginning. So after some evaluation, we narrowed in on the Outer Division Transit Project and the new Park Lane Park in Outer Stark near Rosewood. Those are the sections, that are circled in black here. We focused on these two projects because they're significant investments and because of the existing strength of community organizations in these areas. As you well know, the Division Transit Project connects Gresham to downtown Portland with enhanced bus transit services, and these improvements will reduce travel times up to 20% with buses running every 12 minutes and more often during peak hours. The approximately $175 million project is entering the construction phase soon, with services expected to begin in 2022. Park Lane Park will be expanded from 5 acres to 25 acres. It's a $16 million project funded by Parks SDCs. When fully developed, Park Lane Park will serve 2,237 households, including 407 of whom do not currently have ready access to any park or natural areas. Construction will start in summer 2021 with the opening planned for fall of 2022. So if funded, the plan that you're going to hear about this morning is to build an approach to pilot a cross-bureau approach to develop our anti-displacement actions, and then to test and to learn and refine this approach through these pilots so that we can collectively develop some best practices and begin to operationalize the city's commitment to keeping residents and businesses in place.
So in East Portland, the Housing Bureau has presently 6 new affordable housing developments in progress that encompass more than 532 new homes. Many of these developments in process are actually in these target areas. So we know that we will have some affordable housing new affordable housing to maintain communities within the East Portland community. But we also don't have some tools that we have had in different neighborhoods available to us. As Kimberly indicated, tax increment financing has been a major source of both affordable housing development and for the Housing Bureau, particularly in the Lentz neighborhood, as well as at the interstate TIF district for critical home repair funds so that low-income homeowners can stabilize and remain in their neighborhoods. So in terms of East Portland demographics, I don't think this will come as any shock to you, but we are, when we aligned our investment infrastructures, we also looked at who's living in these neighborhoods and where we want to target our work. So these are obviously do not completely work as an overlay with the little kind of ovals that you saw on the previous map. But this is the latest data that we have from the State of Housing report for 2019 that'll be coming to City Council in the next couple of months, the next couple of weeks. So the neighborhoods that we'll be focusing on are the second and third highest populations of communities of color in the city, which also align with where our transportation and parks infrastructure investments will be going.
Excuse me, Shannon, can you tell me, I'm going to ask, what's the #1 highest percentage of people of color area of the city of Portland?
It's actually the Park Rose Argay neighborhood.
Wow, would not have been my guess.
Interestingly, the Interstate Corridor and MLK Alberta are also above the median. So this is a really interesting table, thank you.
Yeah, and interestingly, even though we talk a lot about displacement in North and Northeast, in terms of homeowners and Black homeowners, in particular, North and Northeast still remains the highest percentages that we see in Black homeownership. So the Housing Bureau is proposing two separate strategies in East Portland related to this work. The first is a renter stabilization initiative. In December of last year, the Housing Bureau held a community budget forum specifically to talk to the community about this budget directive. And we asked a series of questions. The first was, have you or do you know anyone who has been displaced, and what would have helped you or them be stabilized? And what we heard from that community forum, it was that renters prioritized educational opportunities, tenant education and protections, as well as rent assistance. So taking that, as well as some of the program work that we've been doing with the Renter Services Office, we would focus our early displacement interventions on a wraparound case management model that we've seen be very successful in both the fair housing and tenant protection teams. So in particular with the fair housing enforcement teams, we've brought together Fair Housing Council of Oregon, Urban League, Latino Network, and Legal Aid Services of Oregon. And on the tenant protection teams, we've utilized the community partnerships of Community Alliance of Tenants, again, Legal Aid Services of Oregon, Self-Enhancement, Inc., IRCO, and Apano. We would specifically be proposing for a modest $300,000 investment to provide culturally specific high-risk building anti-displacement and case management services for renters in 2 to 4 buildings. This would include organizing renters, providing education, technical assistance, case management, basically tailoring services to what those specific renters need to be able to be sure that they can maintain in the community and the place that they're currently living. We also anticipate this would include some legal assistance, possibly rent assistance, and on occasion even relocation assistance. Sometimes what we find in these vulnerable buildings is, with vulnerable tenants, is that the habitability of their current units is not a condition that they should be remaining in, and that a modest amount of relocation assistance helps them move to somewhere else in the community, but in a unit that's actually a better in terms of habitation.
Excuse me, those are non-publicly funded, privately owned buildings?
Yes.
And are you working collaboratively with the owners or just with the renters?
I think Frida, I think it depends on the situation, whether there is an open owner or whether there is a different kind of relationship with an owner and renter. Frequently it is with an owner, but it's also very common that frankly it's on the tenant side. When you have tenants that are facing habitability issues, increased rents, issues of regarding evictions or otherwise.
And how does this work with the rental services office?
We would encompass the service as part of our rental services office's programming. So it would augment the current services that we have available, but be able to specifically target these services in these neighborhoods.
And following up on Frida's question, I'm trying to figure out how do we stop landlords from raising rents higher than the law allows? Or we know there's a limit that they can raise it to. But I think I need more specifics about really when we talk about renter stabilization. We have housing, as you know, very low-income housing that's in very poor condition. And so I just need a little more explanation about, I would think our goal would be to get people in safe housing, and then if they're not in safe housing, to have a plan to get them in housing that would be safe and affordable. So it just raises so many questions for me, and maybe you're going to answer them, and I'm jumping ahead.
No, I'm happy. So because of this presentation, we were going to go briefly over and highlight the different program areas. I'm happy to go more deeply into the program either now or later during the questioning portion. I'd also ask Matt Shabold, who is running the Office of Renter Services for the Housing Bureau, to come up and join me to be able to go into more details. If you want to do that now, I'm happy to do that.
I'm happy to wait.
Okay. Okay. So we also were proposing a modest amount of funding for homeowner stabilization initiative. And particularly, we would like to focus this effort along the 122nd and Division corridor. The reason for that is over the last 15 years, we have seen an increasing percentage of homeownership in communities of color in this neighborhood that we frankly don't see in the other neighborhood that we're proposing to work in. And specifically, we're seeing increases in Black, Native American, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander homeownership. What we also know, based on the experience that we have seen in North and Northeast, is once neighborhoods start to hit on the market speculators, we start to see a variety of different things occurring to low-income homeowners. Especially, we see predatory lending practices. We see folks not understanding what the values of the home are worth. We also see increased complaints, frankly, from neighbors as the neighborhoods gentrify, and increased pressures on families with code violations. But we also want to make sure that people have the resources that they need to stay in their homes, be those accessibility ramps or critical home repairs. So we'd be proposing a three-part strategy that would include specific targeted, culturally specific outreach and engagement, homeowner retention services that would include resource navigation, financial assistance. We don't know exactly what this will look like for each homeowner we'd identify, but we want to be able to make sure with our community partners that we can tailor a package to make sure that we're reaching their needs. And then also home repair services of the type that we just talked about yesterday in our North and Northeast Oversight Committee report. Our larger home repair loan programs have really only been available in a couple of our tax increment finance districts. And when we maintain a very modest amount of funds from our federal allocation of community development and block grant funding, but for purposes related to the complexities of federal funds, we're not able to offer more than $5,000 of home repair funds for homeowners. We could go into more detail about all the intricacies of why that triggers, but we don't have a citywide source of funds that's available to help low-income senior homeowners stay in their homes when they need something that's above $5,000.
Shannon, for this table, which is really interesting, could you get us the overall home ownership rate change between 2000 and 2017? Are you seeing proportionately more homeowners or proportionally more homes being sold into rentals?
So what we're overall in the city as a whole, we're seeing more and more renters, but we also have to look at where in particular neighborhoods we're seeing increased rates of community of color homeowners, from communities of color.
But no, I'm not being clear in my question.
Okay.
We have certainly we've had an increase in the number of units that have been built, but in terms of home ownership, has that
Overall number gone up?
Yeah, not just the number of renters, but the number of properties that are in rental versus the number of properties that are in home ownership.
We can get that for you.
Yeah, I didn't expect you to have it now. And also, do you have a suggested reason for the very impressive increase in Native American home ownership over this time?
I don't know that we have drilled into exactly why we've seen an increase in this particular neighborhood. We know that we are indeed seeing that. Frankly, the Native American population, though, is also so small. It's very hard for us to calculate with precisity. I think what we're also seeing is these neighborhoods have been less expensive for home ownership for a long time, and naturally that will push people with lower incomes into those neighborhoods.
Yeah, except that I live on a street that's not particularly low income. It's not massively expensive either, but I was just noticing as I was walking down the street going home yesterday that there are increasingly a lot more families of color who are homeowners in my neighborhood. And so I'm not surprised to see these trends, and I'd be very interested to know citywide how that has changed.
Great, we'll be happy to share, and I think
Thank
we're
you.
actually coming back with the full State of Housing report to you in 2 weeks, that will have all of this data citywide.
Great, this is
Wonderful.
fascinating information.
It really is, because as I looked at that huge increase, I thought, well, is it from 1 to 5? Right?
that's true, too.
Right? Because we have done such a poor
Is that
job
just
of,
the rate?
I'm sorry?
It's the rate by race?
Right, it's the rate, right, so
Yeah,
well, rate by race, right?
right.
So from 0 in 2000 to, we're talking over 60%.
Yeah, I suppose if you go from
Increase?
0, that's.
Yeah, so
That
was
is
that
true.
like from 1 to 5?
Okay,
or
very
But we'll find out.
Yeah, thank you.
Sounds more impressive.
Okay. So when we think about commercial stabilization, as you well know, we have a number of tools and programs that are designed to support and stabilize business owners and residents and community organizations. So the map that you see here, and I apologize, it's a little hard to see, but it does show some of the infrastructure. So within the areas that we're focused on, we have our Neighborhood Prosperity Network anchors, so the Rosewood Initiative, the Division Midway Alliance, as well as the Jade District. We also have a number of Inclusive Business Resource Network providers who in the last year served just through the Neighborhood Prosperity Network 103 clients and provided 347 hours of service. We also have a number of workforce development partners, including Human Solutions, ERCO, and Southeast Works, as well as POIC, Youth Builders, and Impact Northwest. Through the adult services, there were 509 participants that were served in East Portland, and about 92% obtained employment at the program exit. And of the youth workforce training, about 69% placed in employment and post-secondary education. And we mention this because as we think about commercial stabilization, we're thinking both about how do we support individual businesses to stay as they're facing potential lease rate increases, but also how individuals maintain the ability to connect to quality employment opportunities. The dots in blue that you see here are business loans and grants that we have provided. We use a racial equity lens and focus on supporting long-time businesses, as well as our Community Livability Grant Program, which is focused on supporting anchor nonprofit organizations that help to make sure that people continue to have the kinds of support and community spaces that they need. And then we have piloted affordable commercial spaces in Lenstown Center and at 106th and Halsey and Gateway that will be coming online soon.
So what is the square foot rental rate for affordable business space?
So right now, so as you know, when you look at a retail lease rate, you're both looking at a combined tenant improvement cost or allowance, as well as your annual lease payments. So we work with individual businesses to determine whether it's more helpful to have additional tenant improvement allowance or to have a reduced rental rate. What we found in Lents is that having a tenant improvement allowance and then a modest reduction in rent is really important. We are just beginning to look at what it would mean for Gateway for 106th and Halsey, but we're looking at somewhere between 10 and 25% reduction.
And is that sufficient to stabilize small businesses?
Well, in the pilot that we do have online is Alberta Commons right now, and with that, the combined discount was higher, and I can get you that information, but it also was combined with a year of free rent from the beginning, and that was really important because it can often be in that first year that you're still getting new customers and you're still figuring out your business model, that can be a particularly important year to have a rent reduction.
That would be helpful.
Okay,
Thank you.
yep, thank you. We'll follow up on that one. We also have been looking at data in terms of commercial lease rates both on the retail and office side. And what you see here is that the East Portland and retail and office rents are increasing at the same rate and following the same trends as the city of Portland as a whole. While there have been increases in East Portland, it remains an affordable place for retail and office employers. And so this combination of lower lease rates equating to lower property values, while potentially having market signals that indicate that there will be market appreciation, can be appealing to investors so that they can buy at a discounted rate, yet still experience increasing rents over time. So I think we are wanting to make sure that we are keeping our eye on property speculation and rent increases. So this aligns with the gentrification typology data we're seeing on the residential side, which is to say that while it's still relatively affordable, the increase in rents is, or the increasing rental rates suggest that we are likely vulnerable to some level of commercial displacement. So based on engagement with the Neighborhood Prosperity Network, our Inclusive Business Resource Network partners, as well as our Budget Advisory Committee, we are requesting $350,000 to retain and build on our existing Inclusive Business Resource Network and Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative to stabilize small businesses in 3 ways. The first is to proactively connect with businesses along the Division Transit line and to provide technical assistance to businesses in relevant languages. So this would be reaching out to businesses and then helping to make sure that they prepare for construction disruption and a potential influx of new customers in language, and potentially understand their options to buy or relocate along the corridor depending on what they're facing. Through the Neighborhood Prosperity Network districts, particularly Division Midway Alliance and Rosewood, we're proposing to provide support for 150 clients through regular drop-in and scheduled meeting office hours in partnership with Livelihood Northwest, which used to be the PSU Business Opportunity Program, including both existing neighborhoods and home-based businesses. And then we are proposing to add a new service. So within the slide here, you see what our Inclusive Business Resource Network encompasses, and that begins with engagement and then a initial assessment, depending on what the business needs, that can go into a prolonged support relationship. But we also have a suite of specialized services, so bookkeeping and digital marketing and market and legal research, as well as credit coaching and tax support, are all things that every business within the Inclusive Business Resource Network can have access to. We are proposing to add a tool within that specialized service, which would be to focus on helping retail businesses, particularly in East Portland, connect to affordable spaces, to program their spaces, and to make informed decisions in lease negotiations, build-out cost, or storefront location. So we think of this as a retail navigator, but given what we're seeing, we think that there would be value in having this service added to the overall network.
Good morning. I'm Andrea Durbin, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability Director. What Directors Branham and Callahan have just described is a place-based equitable community development program of on-the-ground assistance for residents, businesses, and communities. We see this work in East Portland as a case study of how to strengthen our ability to act collectively with community to achieve better outcomes. And it is also a pilot that will inform our citywide approach on displacement and the work that BPS is leading on the Anti-Displacement Action Plan. For its part, BPS is requesting $140,000 to fund a staff position to continue the city and community work underway on the Anti-Displacement Action Plan. This includes recruiting and launching the task force between city and community this summer. The task force will develop and provide ongoing monitoring, assessment, and refinement of the anti-displacement actions. This will be a unique model for doing collaborative work between the city and community that I hope will provide a model in learning for other areas across the city. The work of the task force is to develop an action plan based on research and analysis. BPS staff with the core city team are building the information and policy foundation of the task force to build strategies specific to Portland's conditions and goals. There are 3 areas of work that the task force will focus. 1, updating the city's displacement risk analysis, which is what we use to identify neighborhoods at greatest risk of displacement. Portland was the first city in the nation to do this study a couple of years ago. We have some further work to do with our community partners to refine and improve this analytical tool. 2, we are compiling and evaluating the tools the city already uses and the best practices that could be added to our toolbox to address displacement. 3, we are researching key questions the plan will need to address, such as what should the city prioritize in terms of outcomes and populations affected, what city projects warrant what level of a response, and what is best addressed through citywide strategies or place-based strategies. All of this work will lead to the development of the city's first anti-displacement action plan, which will focus on both citywide approaches and tools to deploy at the project or place-based specific level. Oops. We've made some important progress this year with the anti-displacement work in building the city's understanding and cross-bureau coordination, and of course the city's financial support in enabling anti-displacement PDX to hire a coordinator who will be well-positioned to partner with the city staff and other community organizations to carry out this work. As our community partners prepare themselves to engage and work with the city, we will shift to this next phase of work I just described, launching the City Community Task Force on Displacement this summer. BPS's funding request will support our ability to launch this joint city community task force, refine the displacement analysis, and collaboratively develop and identify tools and move into action in applying these tools. The council's support for this joint initiative will enable us to continue to build momentum, apply the city's commitment to stabilizing residents and businesses to 2 specific significant investments being made and planned in East Portland, and better learn how we apply this work more broadly and operationalize this work across our bureaus.
Happy to take any questions this time.
So I think one of my major questions is around Prosper Portland's plan is very dependent on cannabis tax dollars. And so I am very concerned that if this plan is passed as presented, that we are making a commitment long-term to taking cannabis funds to fund a program that, in fact, I don't personally believe should be funded with cannabis funds. Without cannabis funds, how will we be successful in implementing this cross-bureau collaborative process?
So when we present our full budget, we'll be able to show the role that cannabis plays in throughout our economic development program. Right now, it represents about 10% of our resources. So I think we would like to have a conversation around, for the ongoing portion of cannabis that has been dedicated, how we might backfill with general fund, which had been the funding source historically for the Inclusive Business Resource Network. But we still would have 90% of our resources, even if cannabis were to go away. It's still an important portion of it that represents of our $7 million, approximate $7 million annual economic development budget. That's $700,000, and so that's 3-4 programs. But it's not, it doesn't represent the majority of the resources that we have to support this important work.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Other questions?
Good morning. I'd just like to say I'm pleased to see the collaboration and the consideration of residential and commercial stabilization side by side. I think that's really smart and appropriate, since a lot of people who are at risk for displacement are also small business owners. I used to be one. And I was displaced once from my commercial space and twice from my residence. So I guess we've had this conversation before. I'm very jealous of the San Francisco Legacy Business Program. I'm glad to see that lease negotiation is on the list of services you'd provide, because I think that's it's just the basic starting point for ensuring stability. I would love to see us in maybe year 2 or 3, finding resources for rent subsidies for legacy businesses who are going concerns, who are an essential part of the fabric of their communities, but are at risk of displacement. And in San Francisco, that's based on the number of employees, so it's linked to kind of economic impact. Commercial land trusts are another thing I want to put on the table that could provide long-term stability. I know the mayor hates this idea, but commercial rent control is also something I am interested in. And I think my main question is, what, if any, community advisory bodies are advising you on this work currently? Or if they're not, what will that look like moving forward?
Those are all really great suggestions. And so what we have thought about is Planning and Sustainability and the Housing Bureau are working with Anti-Displacement PDX, which has a very strong residential focus. I think we've wanted to partner and potentially bring together a complementary but potentially different group that represents small local businesses and understands the unique experience of businesses. And so I'm anticipating that we might be 6 months behind. We need to do some more analysis on the action planning, but we would like to, in the same way that Planning and the Housing Bureau are looking at an anti-displacement action plan that focuses on residential stabilization, we'd like to do the same thing on the commercial side. So in an ideal world, we kick that off this summer to begin having a conversation and to really do the research that we need to, along with key partners. So we would appreciate any suggestions that you have in terms of who would be good thought partners on that. And certainly, we want to build on the Inclusive Business Resource Network and the infrastructure that we do have today.
Great. I would love to be part of that conversation. I work with PBA and Better Business for Portland, and I'm the new liaison to Venture Portland. So
Great.
I'm going to be getting more involved in the small business conversation moving forward. I've also told you before, I would love to bring back the Small Business Advisory Commission. I don't know that that is the body that would necessarily inform this project. It seems like an ad hoc committee might be more appropriate.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in both.
Great. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Follow up.
Oh, go ahead, Frida.
Well, first of all, thank you for focusing on East Portland. As you know, that's where I'm from and very concerned about the displacement. I mentioned to a couple of you that I'd be sharing some numbers. We look at this, public entities move slow, and we appreciate the work being done. But what we're finding in David Douglas, which incorporates a large portion of East Portland, that year over year, from 18 to 19, we had a drop of 551 students. Our ADMW, which we're funded at, dropped 400, and our free and reduced lunch dropped by 350. This is an indication of the lower incomes being displaced. But through this whole process, you talk about community of color, which is important to us. We have only less than 50% of our district is classified under white. The issue is, though, a large portion of them, we have a very large Slavic community, immigrant community, that should be considered as well, because they fall with same of the handicaps that groups of color do when they're trying to start a business, find an apartment, et cetera. They have large families. It's still the same. So I think maybe inclusiveness of immigrants as well, because then you capture those people who are being overlooked because they don't fall under the class of people of color, but they suffer just as much. I did have a question
Can I
about
just
your...
respond to that really quickly? So So we have taken a page from the Coalition of Communities of Color definition of who is encompassed within communities of color, and immigrants and Slavic communities can be included within that. So I think it's a helpful reminder to be clear about who we're talking about. Immigrants and refugees are certainly a priority when we're talking about business technical assistance. I imagine the same would be true, but we have an ongoing partnership with IRCO, and a lot of what we're seeing when the Jade District or Division Midway or Rosewood works with communities, it is in multiple languages, and so we do need people who have fluency in Russian and others. So point taken, and that is when we're talking about focusing on businesses owned by people of color, we should be more clear. We also mean people who are immigrants and refugees.
Okay, I did have one question about your anti-displacement, I guess you could call it analysis. Is that just when public projects are being done, or is it public, large public and private, that analysis is done? Or planning to be done, I guess?
That's actually part of the scope of work that the City Community Anti-Displacement Task Force will be answering. That's one of the questions that we need to answer, because, I mean, what are the scope of projects, whether it's public only, what kind of projects, what level, what are those triggers that we know that we need to do this level of analysis? So we haven't developed those answers yet.
Well, I encourage you to consider private development, because some of them can be quite large in East Portland because of the land.
That's good feedback.
I also just wanted to ask the question about the decision package said there'd be 80 to 240 renters that would be assisted through case management. And that's a big range, 80 to 240. So what happens if we get 80, and what happens if we get 240, and why is such a huge range?
The range is based on the number of apartments that we would, rental units that we would expect to be able to work in. So as I mentioned earlier, we thought it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4. And we would ask our community partners to help identify those buildings and renters who are most vulnerable and need these services for anti-displacement. And frankly, I think it's because a little bit about the pilot nature of the programming as well. So, but we want to be able to be flexible if there's, if there's a building that's more vulnerable and it's only 40 people, as opposed to a building of 80 people, that our partners are able to go and do the work they need to do.
And so I guess the last question I have is, as I think about operations that Prosper does, like My People's Market and some other big business opportunities, I haven't heard any conversations about incubator spaces where small businesses actually would be able to have little kiosks where they could work from on a permanent basis. As I think about opportunities that may present themselves, whether it's with Lloyd Center or whether it's with Concordia College or some other big land opportunities that we may have, I just want us to be thinking outside of the box about what the potential is. Those businesses always do very well when there's an event, but they also have to eat when there's, more than twice a year. So it would be good to really think about how do we help make those businesses prosper, whether or not there's a big event that's taking place. And I think incubator spaces have proven over the years to be very helpful in helping small businesses grow. Any additional questions? Yes.
Really just a clarification. Thanks so much for being here and for your presentation. I'm looking at the renter stabilization and the homeowner stabilization piece, and I'm just trying to make sure that it looks from the diagram, which I know I shouldn't rely on, but it looks like that city is actually doing the culturally specific outreach and services, and I'm hoping that that's not the case, that we're connecting with those organizations, because this way, we're not connecting with them until it's time for a referral by this. So
No, both of the packages, we would be expecting to use community partners and not Housing Bureau staff. So we would be contracting for these services
Right.
out in the community. That's why there's no FTE associated with any of the positions
Right.
at the Prosper or the Bureau. We'd be putting those money directly out to community partners.
Thank you. And then I have one other question, and this is just because on the way in today, I was listening to the mayor and the governor and everybody on COVID And I'm wondering what kind of adjustments, or when are you going to start thinking about adjustments to what you're asking for based on what's going to happen or what we think might happen? Or I'm kind of curious about that. Or have you actually started to do
We are-
those discussions
I
yet?
think we are all too. I mean, I think we're all, you know, we didn't have the opportunity to hear the mayor's press conference, and I know there's probably a lot of things that are to come that I think council will be having to address and deal with.
So along those lines, I just wanted to chime in and make sure that council's aware that this is, while this is coming forward as a one-time request, the bureaus have indicated that in order to be successful, it's likely that they would need continued support for at least a couple of years. And so I just want to be sure that everybody understands that if this is, and I think it's obviously there's clear and compelling need for this type of investment, but that it will likely be, in order to be successful or even know if it's being successful, you will need to be committing to at least a few years of this type of level of resource.
I appreciate that clarification, and I'm always a big fan of one-time requests that end up, being around for 10, 20, 30 years. I actually did have one more question. East Portland has the least amount of service supports, and so I get concerned when we are reliant on a couple of organizations to carry the load for a community that has not been well organized, a community that has not been well engaged, and that our whole premise is that we have a few organizations that we have good relationships with, and they're going to do the heavy lifting. I live in East Portland, so I know most people aren't connected to an organization, whether it's culturally specific or not. And so unless there's a real plan to engage people who today are not engaged, then we're just going to be talking to the usual suspects who already are organized, who already are having their voice included in city deliberations. And so I am very concerned that we're just kind of assuming that based on something that the Coalition of Communities of Color has said, that that's kind of the framework that we're operating under. That's not the frame I'm operating under because, again, most people aren't connected to any organization. So I really will need to see something, especially if I'm going to make a financial commitment over a few years, that really shows how we're going to engage people who today are not engaged in East Portland and how we're going to make sure that we're centering those voices as well.
So I have a few more questions, but I'm going to save them for follow-up conversations because they're kind of broader questions about the business model. But I wanted to take a moment to appreciate the racial equity work that you are doing. Thank you. To help culturally specific small businesses, especially the MPIs. I've heard really great feedback and seen good results. So I'd like to see more of that approach brought to property redevelopment work that Prosper does. And I also want to appreciate Prosper in naming the anti-displacement work being discussed as part of your future plans, because as you know, what do we call it? It's not a bureau, agency, entity,
Yeah, agency. Agency's good.
played a big role in displacement in the past that we really need to acknowledge and talk about how we're going to remedy that moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so next up, we have the Portland Housing Bureau. As they are getting prepared and settled, I'll just draw your attention to their one-page document. So as a bureau, they have approximately $142.5 million. They are the 9th largest out of 28 bureaus. Their general fund allocation, while it shows $37.8 million, the vast majority of that general fund resource actually passes through to the joint office. So the Bureau itself has about $5.2 million of direct general fund subsidy, which would actually make it the 14th largest general fund bureau. So again, the majority of those resources go to the joint office for homeless services. So you can see within their total requested budget, the largest expenditure category is external materials and services, with about 90.5% of their budget going towards those efforts. And then they have about 82 full-time equivalent staff. Their largest program in terms of dollar is their GO bond, comes from their GO bond, and it's multifamily rental housing. So you see that program has $58 million, and then that's followed by a multifamily affordable rental project financing. So again, the vast majority of their resources come from the bonds and/or other funding sources that go directly to constructing affordable homes. With that, I will turn it over to Director Callahan.
May I just do a time check? I'm not sure what time we're supposed to be ending our presentation and want to make sure there's enough time for questions.
So we are supposed to turn it back over to Prosper at 10:50. So you have just short of 30 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Good morning. Shannon Callahan, Portland Housing Bureau Director. I'm joined by Matthew Schbold, our Planning and Policy Manager, as well as Molly Rogers, our Deputy Director. Ms. Leslie Goodlow, our Business Operations Manager, rounds out our team, who's also in the audience, making sure we're practicing apparently good social distancing. So, as you know, the Housing Bureau works to produce and preserve affordable housing, prevent displacements, create homeownership opportunities, stabilize homeowners in their current living situations, and through our joint office partner, work to end homelessness. The next slides you're going to see regarding our budget deal specifically with the funding that is within the Portland Housing Bureau's control. As Jessica mentioned, and we are the agency that holds the IGA with the Joint Office of Homeless Services, so the bulk of the general fund dollars that are within the Housing Bureau go to the Joint Office on an ongoing basis. The Housing Bureau has only $3 million in general fund allocation. This is a pie chart of our 2021 budget excluding the joint office. As Jessica indicated, approximately 77% of our funding is encompassed in our rental projects in development. The next largest chunk of our programming is for homeownership programs and then rental services. Our rental production pipeline is presently the largest pipeline we have ever had. And we have over 3,100 units of affordable housing in various stages of development throughout our community. I'd also like to note that in this pipeline, 20% of the units are actually inclusionary housing units. In the last couple of years, inclusionary housing has actually become a very important part of our affordable housing creation. I'd also like to note that for the first time, we have over 30%, nearly 30% of our units in the pipeline are deeply affordable units, which, as you know, are in very short supply in the community and are made possible largely by rent support being provided through Home Forward or VASH vouchers coming from Home Forward to provide rent assistance. I'm quickly going to go over a number of our strategic initiatives. One of the most important initiatives we've been undertaking in the last 2 years is Portland's housing bond. We have announced 12 projects in various stages of development or opened throughout Portland. We believe that all 12 of those developments, we will exceed all of the goals that we set and promised to the community in terms of unit count, number of 0 to 30 units, which we also refer to as deeply affordable, family size units, and importantly, supportive housing units. I'd like to thank our whole team and in particular our Deputy Director, Molly Rogers, for her work on the Portland Housing Bond.
So Shannon, I just wanted to take a moment to applaud exceeding all your goals for 2019. That's a huge accomplishment. Knowing what you had ahead of you, congratulations to your team. Should stop and appreciate that for a moment.
Good job. We'll do a little self-bow. Thank you very much. It really has been a full team effort and frankly, a citywide effort. We rely very heavily on our partners who do bonding at the Office of Management and Finance. And we're very proud of our work and really frankly can't wait for the buildings to open and be welcoming new residents. So thank you, Commissioner. This listing actually talks a little bit more specifically about all of the projects that are underway. Three of the new developments will be in East Portland. 2 are in the Cully neighborhood, which has also been an area in need of, and has very similar trends to East Portland generally, though not in the same proximity. And then we also have achieved some buildings in some very high opportunity neighborhoods, including Laurelhurst, which I will say has been a dream for the Housing Bureau for many years to be able to bring affordable housing to the Laurelhurst neighborhood. And we're really excited that that will actually be occurring. The projects in total will house more than 2,900 people. And we've been able to leverage an additional $20 million in private financing for these projects that was made possible by the constitutional amendment that voters passed subsequent to the bond. 200 million. I'm sorry, 200. Thank you, Molly. Did I say 20? Oh, well, yes. We just, look at that. We increased that by tenfold just now.
How cool. It's a little difference, huh?
One of the other commitments that that we were asked by the community and passed on to our development partners is we want to make sure that all of our partners have committed to construction equity throughout the process, and all partners either have experience or committed to reaching 30% MWB ESB goals. And we are actually going to be working with Prosper Portland to supplement some of the funds that are coming from the city's CEIP program, and they've agreed to pool with those resources. We'll be pairing $300,000 of our own bond administrative funding to help ensure that we have teams available to help increase goals and also break down some of the work in these developments so that we can get not just people who are at the contracting level, but at the workforce level, and try to make sure that these investments are actually benefiting the community as a whole. You've heard a lot yesterday about our North and Northeast strategy and where we are on the 5-year anniversary. I'd also just like to note that since the North and Northeast Oversight Committee prepared their report, we have already increased our home ownership by, we're at 40. We're at 39. So we've already increased those numbers by another 6 homeowners.
Yesterday, yay.
Well, their report went through the end of 2019, so, but yes, just yesterday. Dana's been hard at work since last night.
Gonna say she's good.
As I mentioned at the start of our presentation, inclusionary housing has become an even more important part of our work at the Housing Bureau. We, though these units don't achieve deeply affordable units, we have set up the program so that it is more attractive for developers to provide us units at 60% AMI, and 55% of the units that they are programming are at 60% AMI. For those of you who are a little unfamiliar with the program, the state mandate or the state allowance to us to use inclusionary zoning said that we could not mandate units below 80%. And so what we've done is design a program that makes it more attractive for the private market to give us units at 60% MFI voluntarily.
So am I to understand, Shannon, that these 600 units are at 60%?
55% of those units are at 60%.
And the rest are at 80%?
Yes.
And do you have a breakdown about size? Because I got to tell you, this is one of the programs that gives me the most heartburn because of the little we get for our dollars. Do you have a breakdown on the size of those units? Because my experience has been there's a lot of studios and 1-bedrooms, but not a lot of family units are being created through this inclusionary housing.
So 23% is the number of units that are 2 bedrooms and above, either have been developed or in the pipeline. Commissioner, we'd be happy to have a further conversation with you about inclusionary housing there. And we are actually beginning the process of a market analysis on inclusionary program as we stand today. The biggest incentive that we're able to offer the private developers is a 10-year tax abatement. And I think we have not done the best job in expressing how long that tax abatement is benefiting the community. developers are bound to give us 99 years of affordability for that 10-year tax abatement. And so over the value of the life of the building, we think that it's a more reasonable investment than if you just look at the 10-year timeframe of the tax investment. That said, there are also some places that we think are some building typology, some areas of the city that are achieving a greater benefit than others, frankly. The city and county also established 2 years ago a joint goal to achieve 2,000 new units of supportive housing. I think we all know that providing services and wraparound services to help people stabilize in their homes for the long term is one of the best solutions that we know, especially to the problem of chronic homelessness. We have achieved in a 2-year time period opening of 240 new units and have planned at least 552 units as well. We're working on a weekly basis, daily basis sometimes with the joint office to pair both our funding to create the units with their capital resources. I think one of the things we're most proud of is our ability in the last 2 solicitations that we've released to pair the service dollars and the capital funding dollars. Traditionally, we've had affordable housing providers come in, try to get capital here, maybe try to find service dollars, and it creates a huge mismatch. But being upfront and clear, if you come in and we'll give you the capital if you can meet these service delivery plans, we think it's going to be part of our success to being able to get units out more quickly. I'd like to introduce what I call the rental services peacock. Matthew is hoping, I never use that term because he's hoping it doesn't get known that way, but this is our best representation of all of the services that the renter services team offers through our rental services office, which has been in place for about 2 years, Matthew, now, started 2 to 3 years. These are current numbers on what we're doing in terms of outreach and education for tenants, for landlords. We have a small amount of housing stabilization services. And of course, fair housing continues to remain an important part of our service delivery model. One of the things I think that I'd like to acknowledge our team for is in this last year, they have piloted different programs so that we're not just in our office at the city, but they're going out to libraries in the community, holding open office hours, doing this on weekends as well, and have even voluntarily offered to change their work schedule so they can be available to calls when people have needed it the most on the weekend. So I think we've tried to be as nimble as we can and meet the needs of the renter and landlord community as we navigate, especially new city policies. And then I want to talk just briefly about how we look at and measure equity in terms of our bureau. One of the most important factors for us, of course, is how are we representing in terms of leadership and staff, both communities of color and diversity of gender. We have had a focus on this and a very intense focus on this with our business operations manager as the lead, who's taken a number of steps to make sure that we're doing, we've changed how we do interviews, we changed how we do reviews, we changed how we do recruitments. And our team and leadership team reflects the diversity both in terms of gender and of color that are of our bureau as a whole, and we're extremely proud of that. We also look at equity in terms of our construction projects. We have set higher goals than the rest of the city, and so far we've been able to achieve those goals. We're continuing to ramp up our participation goals, looking towards a 30% participation goals, but we're also looking at the workforce of who is actually working on our jobs and getting the opportunities generally.
Shannon, before you move on from that slide, yesterday when we were talking about the Northeast housing strategy, I was very impressed with the large number of minority contractors. It was like a 48%, something like that. But they were 48% non-certified contractors of color. And so I'm very curious at whether or not you are restricted to using co-bid certified contractors, or whether you are also scanning the universe outside of that very small pool.
So while we increase our participation rates, we are particularly talking about co-bid, but we're also looking at different ways of reaching workforce and folks that are not in that system. We rely very heavily on our own development, that our affordable housing developers in the private market, to actually work to achieve these numbers, and we want to make sure that we're providing them the right support as well. But we do have some of our providers have become particularly adept through the years at learning how to break these projects apart, and also to provide opportunity to folks who aren't certified. I think one of the most important things is making sure that people at all levels of the pipeline, in terms of construction pipeline, are having access to these jobs. And then, we also have to look really closely at who's getting the particular types of work.
Yes.
If you're only talking about painting, or you're only talking about some low skills, and when you represent communities of color, it's not providing the same opportunity as plumbing or electric. It's not the same kind of money or the same kind of path for you and your family, so.
Yeah, let me just say that there's a term that people have started using, and know how the city loves to adopt new terminology, but it's called BIPOC. So
BIPOC?
it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Because what we've learned is that when we just say people of color, some communities become invisible. And if we are intentional about undoing harm that we've done with public policy in the past, I think it would be a really good thing for us to adopt BIPOC, right? It's just an acknowledgement that if you don't spell out Black and Indigenous, they just become invisible. And so we never have a conversation about those communities.
Thank you, Commissioner. We also look at who lives in our affordable units, and who and trends over time. We are working with our providers more closely at the point of marketing and lease-up to make sure that there are more opportunities for folks to move into affordable units. They are a precious commodity, the regulated affordable units. Our portfolio, residents in our portfolio, 33% identify as elderly, and 26% identify as having a disability. We also are looking at who receives our services. So generally, overall, our home buying assistance, we've been able to ensure that we're working to decrease the minority homeownership gap. And we are working to change that, and we have been trending differently on home repair, but not quite to the same levels that we've been able to achieve with home buying assistance. We were asked to also talk with you a little bit about challenges facing the Bureau. And challenges, there's a lot of challenges facing the Housing Bureau, but I think this is one of the most important things that we need to be talking with you and the community about, and we are starting to prepare for, and it is our financial forecast. And so in very simplified terms, what you have before you is the financial forecast for the Housing Bureau. We forecast 12 years out, but are particularly looking at the next 5 years. We are a bureau that was created primarily with TIF resources and have done our work primarily through tax increment financing. Over the last few years, we've had the benefit of the Portland Housing Bond, voter-approved bond. We will have the benefit very soon in place in Portland of the Metro Regional Bond Funds, and we have been able to eke out and carve out some specific funding for the Housing Bureau. But what we are facing in the next 5 years is a decline of resources, which will reduce our available funding down to where we haven't seen in quite some time. We've known that this was coming. It's been commonly referred to as the TIF cliff. But based on a variety of different factors, we've extended that time period out. This next year, in conversations with the mayor's office, We hope to bring you both an alignment of our current resources, what we can do to maximize those resources and what we can achieve after the next 5 years. And we're also hoping that we can start to have conversations about resources that will prioritize affordable housing now and into the future. We know that, that may be a type of housing bond, but I think for affordable housing development to remain at the significant levels and to achieve the goals, I think we're going to need to bring you some creative potential solutions. So I just wanted to end on that, because as we're in these times of high production, that is not necessarily where our agency will be in 5 years, absent any other changes. So with that, we'll turn it over to your questions.
Questions?
Hello, good morning. Couple questions. First of all, is this information that you're sharing with the public, and if yes, where can they find it?
Most of this information is within a number of different presentations that we've done, but we'll post it up on our website, and it's also up on the CBO's website today, I believe.
I think it's really important to push this information out, because there is a general impression in the city that we are not doing anything about our housing crisis, when the reality is we're doing more than ever, but we're continuing to see an influx of people into cost-burdening displacement and homelessness. And we're not doing enough. We can't solve it by ourselves, but at the very least, I would like the people of Portland to know what we are doing, especially compared to what has been done over the last 20 years. So in 2001, City Council unanimously adopted the no net loss of affordable housing units into the central city. And then over a decade or more, I guess 15 or more years, we saw a significant decline, I think of around 1,500 units. Where are we now with that number in the central city?
So we are meeting the no net loss policy currently in the central city, but we have both been increasing the number of regulated affordable units just as a city priority.
I can barely hear you.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
So we are meeting the central city no net loss policy, but the city has been making up for the loss in the number of market rate affordable units. So in 2002, there were about 5,300 regulated units and around 2,900 market rate units that were affordable, which gave us that no net loss policy of no fewer than 8,200 units affordable in the central city.
And market rate, that would be naturally occurring
That's
affordable
correct.
housing? Okay.
That's correct.
Which is completely gone now,
For
right?
the most part, it
Okay.
is completely gone. And so in 2019, we have around 8,700 units in the central city that are affordable. And that is a split of around 8,000 that are regulated by the Housing Bureau, and then around 800 that are naturally occurring affordable housing. And so we have seen a dramatic decrease in the number of naturally occurring affordable housing units, and the city investment from TIF and other funds have made up the difference.
Matt, can you give me a sense of when that, when we caught up? I mean, now we've exceeded, but I mean, the numbers in 2002, which we know it's not nearly enough for today's reality, but
I'd want to check, but I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, we were below the 2002 numbers, and all of the funding through the bonds and the TIF lift and kind of reallocation of funds into affordable development has boosted us now over the 2002 number.
I cannot overemphasize how important it is for us to clearly share this information with the public. Our inclusionary housing policies are contributing to these numbers. Our housing bonds are helping, and this council has been particularly effective. But again, because people don't see a difference in the visible homeless population, they believe we're not doing anything. And that's going to lead to a future lack of support for housing initiatives. And that's my primary concern. And just the need to inform the public, which is very challenging without a paper of record and the public receiving information from a billion different sources. This is one of my new missions, is getting accurate information out to the public so they can make informed decisions about what measures they're going to support, about what policies they're going to support. It's just vitally important. Thank you.
Go, Frida?
First of all, I want to thank the Housing Bureau. As co-chair of Housing for East Portland Action Plan, they have worked collaboratively with us in East Portland. We've been advocating about displacement for 5 years, and we appreciate in the budget the person they've added who's going to be working directly with our committee. I also would like to thank them because we were trying to promote and advocate for a preference policy, which is very difficult to implement. But Shannon and I have some discussions. What we're doing to help stabilize housing for our families, which is near and dear to my heart as a school board member, is to do marketing to our homeless liaisons, which is really going to be beneficial for the families that are already homeless or at risk of being homeless. And so I really appreciate all that work. Now, I do have a question. On your who lives in our affordable units, you show an average income of $18,825. Is that a household income or an individual income?
That's the household income.
Okay. Oh, and then, why don't you go ahead now?
Oh, okay, Frida, I'll hold down the fort while you get some water. I also want to just once again really appreciate the incredible work that you do. I know that the Housing Bureau doesn't get the kind of credit that it deserves for really having an impact on moving people into housing that they can permanently afford to live in. So I want to start there and just really appreciate that. Matt, when you were giving Commissioner Udaley numbers about whether or not we're meeting our goals around housing that people can afford to live in, I have to go back to the average rent and our subsidized units and the average annual income. Can you tell me what I used to know this, but can you tell me what the amount of money you'd have to make an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom in the city of Portland?
Oh, you're testing me on this. It's somewhere in the $25 to $30 an hour range. But
Thank you. It's in that area, right? I won't quote you, promise, Matt. But my point is that, as Commissioner Udaley said, the difference between housing people can afford to live in and what's actually available for rent is really significant in the city of Portland. And it doesn't feel like we have a plan to address that gap between what people are earning and what people are being forced to pay for rent. And I know we've got some plans for East Portland, but this is a problem all over the city of Portland. Are we going to be able to make a dent at all? Are people going to be able to be comfortable that, they're going to be able to stay in the neighborhood that they're in? To me, that keeps me up at night, because we keep talking about affordable housing, but it's not really affordable, right? What's affordable are these housing units, right? And the ones that your community partners are helping you build. Those are the affordable units. And the other stuff is stuff that just doesn't fit that criteria. So that's my soapbox.
Commissioner, I think this keeps all of us up at night. I mean, I think it's why all of us are trying to do the work that we're doing. And yes, I mean, the regulated portfolio of affordable housing is not going to solve everyone's housing crisis. I mean, I think we all believe very strongly that building more and more regulated units, though, where we have permanent affordability, are extremely important. And I do think over time, with a robust inclusionary housing policy, I think back about, if we had adopted an inclusionary housing policy 2 decades ago when we first had indication that we should at the city, and it was first proposed in initial reports by the predecessor agency from Planning and Sustainability, and where if we had captured all of that new development with 10 to 20% of the units even being affordable at 60 to 80%, where we'd look generationally. So I think it's all of these component pieces and frankly a little bit more. But I appreciate you giving us a chance for a soapbox, and I think it's going to be more important for us to do our work that we find dedicated resources for the development of affordable housing for our partners to be able to continue to provide that in the community. And of course, tenant protections and being able to address issues in the market so that there's frankly not the price gouging that we've seen on the renter side is also an important component with our rental services office.
My last question. Do we have any data on retention? So we've moved thousands of people into housing. Are they keeping the housing we're moving them into?
You know the tenure of the folks that we're moving to housing. Matt, do you have that by any chance?
Yeah. It's, for our regulated portfolio, about 7.4 years on average.
Say that again.
7.4 years is the average for how long a household stays in our regulated units.
I don't know that that actually answers my question about whether or not people are able to, are people able to, you said, I'm sorry, answer it again. Maybe I didn't hear it.
No, I'm not sure I am answering your question. The information we do have on people living in our regulated units is that they stay there on average in their unit for 7.4 years. What we don't have is that kind of longitudinal tracking about what happens to people once they are leaving the unit. We don't track on that level.
But what's the level of people who go back into homelessness?
From our regulated housing,
Yeah.
we don't have that. I'd want to check with the Joint Office on, the Joint Office collects information on rates of reentry into homelessness, but I don't know if it can be disaggregated for reentry from market rate housing versus regulated affordable housing. We'd have to check with our colleagues at the Joint Office.
Thank you. I think it's good for us to know, as going back to what Commissioner Udaley said, if we can't tell the story about what it is we're doing, then the public thinks we're not doing anything. Any other questions?
I do.
I wanted to add a little, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Just feel free to answer these as briefly as possible, and we can follow up later if you don't have the info on hand. First of all, do we include cost of living increases or other mechanisms to make sure we are properly compensating, for our nonprofit partners to ensure that their workers are being properly compensated if their costs are increasing and we expect the same level of service from them?
We do try and provide cost of living adjustments, but given the volume of funds that are not general fund, right, general fund, we see increases based on cost of living for city services. So we try and match that, but it's probably not as regular as we see in the general fund services.
I've just noticed that we often, this is not a Housing Bureau specific issue. We don't consider inflation or cost of living, and we just keep giving the same amount every year, expecting people to do the same and sometimes more work with the same amount of money. So I wanted to just put that out there as a concern.
If I can, Commissioner, for some of in the last, I would say, fiscal year and a half or so, we have had to do some restructuring in our contracts to be supportive of our community partners, because they have been having more trouble retaining staff.
Yeah.
And so there's been a dialogue in our contract negotiations to either increase funding if we have it, or to accept a reduced level of service, knowing that they're having their own retention issues and workforce issues, and we want to be supportive.
Because their staff can't afford to live in Portland either.
That's right.
Have we considered setting aside funding from a bond or other sources to be able to respond to emergencies and opportunities, whether a need to acquire a property or organize vulnerable tenants?
The bond resources, we have not considered necessarily what I guess I would term what you're contemplating as maybe an opportunity fund. One of the things we've been talking with the community about in general is, so first of all, the bond is really only useful for capital costs. So
Yeah,
we
I
could do an acquisition or a rehab. We're also, frankly, we're not extremely nimble. We've been as nimble as we could as a government entity and agency, but we do have public process. We do go to council for approval. There are a variety of different steps. So we're never going to be situated in that kind of emergent situation to be as competitive as a market player. We have in the past established with other entities like NOAA, Oregon's affordable housing kind of infrastructure. We have a revolving loan fund with them that we seeded with one-time resources from the general fund about 3 or 4 years ago now, that is able to be kind of that more nimble resource. If we were to have those type of available funds, frankly, I don't know that it would be, we would want to seek that type of partnership so that there was someone else who could kind of take that action step.
Sure, that's fair. And then in the decision package for community development mitigating displacement, can you tell me more about the Housing Bureau activities? And specifically, I'm interested in understanding how we decide on interventions and whether to expand existing services or try new approaches.
Would you like specific information on the homeownership strategy or the renter or both?
Probably both, and feel free to follow up with me later.
Okay,
I don't
we'll
want
do
to
that,
take up too
Commissioner.
much
Thank
time
you.
with this. Thank you.
I just wanted to add a little bit to the soapbox. So a number of years ago, the Coalition for Communities of Color came out with a report that said in our local area, 84% of single mothers of color with kids under 5, 84% are living below the federal poverty line. And I hope that they'll replicate that report with new census data. So I wondered kind of, and I don't need an answer about this, but I sort of wondered in looking at this, what kind of lens you apply to this overlapping kind of layer of obstacle that is race, gender, maternal status. And additionally, having young kids means that you have the greatest amount of kind of work-life conflict and ability to maintain stable employment, and how you're applying that lens to the variety of different program interventions that you might be offering. In particular, knowing that there are a lot of barriers to creating family-size affordable housing, in particular for this population of folks who are very much at risk of displacement with huge impacts to themselves and their kids far into the future. So I wanted to put out there that I appreciate the lens that has been shared today, and hope and appreciate the work that you all are doing, and hope that there's some additional reflection on this particular population.
Thank you, and I think we'd love to provide you a little bit more thought on that, and we'd give you a response. There's also some areas that I think we know we would like to do more work in, and in particular, we'd like to bring high-quality, affordable childcare into our affordable housing developments. And, you know, it's not been something that has been, not just Housing Bureau, but globally very, very easy to achieve, because you're also looking for those resources on the resource side. But that's really one of the areas I think that we think is really most important to help families not only really stabilize, but be able to advance and succeed. And marrying affordable, quality childcare is really, I think, on our prioritization list.
That is absolutely music to my ears, and I will say, I think there's some opportunity for near-term collaboration between the city, county, and metro to talk that through, and also to talk through the part that you were mentioning before about who's involved in construction trades, and the fact that if we don't start figuring out how, with our housing bonds and various other construction tools, to have a childcare set aside that actually allows for women to be apprentices and work in the trades, we are not going to be able to close the gap on the number of women working in these family wage jobs. Not to mention that when we have these huge construction projects, we often compress existing childcare resources with bringing in additional workforce for the families living in the communities where we're constructing these homes. So I think it's a huge and relevant piece.
Good point.
I have just real quick. One's a comment in regard to your homeowner education. You're working with the immigrant and community as well as people of color. One of the things that come up in our civic engagement with East Portland Action Plan is that included in that education, there should be a piece on environmental risks and issues, what they're finding quite often with these some predatory practices, that people are buying a home that has contaminations. Not in the house, the focus has always been on lead and lead paint, but in East Portland, that is an issue. What we're finding is in the soil. I've known a few cases where the child has been adversely impacted because of what the property had been used to before, but people don't know to ask these questions. The other question was, you talked about the 10-year tax abatement. I'm working with developers out in East Portland or talking with them. The private sector, is there consideration, I believe it's a state limit, if I'm right, it's a state thing on the limitation to 10 years tax abatement? Is there consideration about advocating or lobbying for raising it to 15 years so private sector can pencil out their projects more when they're trying to include more than 20% of units affordable?
We have not thought about bringing, at least the Housing Bureau has not thought about bringing a specific request to the legislature to increase the time length of the tax exemption. I think that involves multiple layers and multiple decision points. Any approval we seek at the city to use the tax exemption also requires the assent of Multnomah County based on the way the law is set up in terms of who needs to assent, because we're not just talking about the tax exemption as it relates to the city's portion, but we're talking about the school district's portion, and we're talking about the portion that goes to Multnomah County. I would challenge some local developers, frankly, on the fact that it does or doesn't, that the benefit isn't there from the tax exemption. I think that there's some question about other factors that go into a developer's calculation. I would want to make sure I was looking at their pro forma really closely to see what their profits and what other factors would go into their development as overall.
Can I do a time check? Are we, okay, we need to move on. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate the info.
All right, so I am passing around a slightly updated Prosper Portland one-pager. It just has a little bit of additional information. So Prosper Portland, their adopted budget this year is about $7.6 million, the 20th largest out of 28 bureaus. Their general fund allocation is about $6.9 million, which is the 13th largest. What you'll notice is the one-pager looks a little bit different, and that's because we have an IGA with Prosper Portland. They don't actually budget within our, budget all of their expenditures within our budgeting system or within our accounting system. So you'll see all of the expenses are in external materials and services because we send everything to them via an IGA. The Bureau has provided information to us that states that the general fund allocation supports 11 FTE, and the majority of their expenses go towards materials and services costs, with about 73% of it going towards materials and services costs, and about 21% of the allocation going towards those 11 FTE. With that, I will turn it over to Director Branham.
Good morning. Good morning. Great to see you, Commissioners, Auditor Caballero, Directors, and Budget Advisors. I'm Tavo Cruz, the Board Chair of Prosper Portland, and I'm pleased to participate in today's work session on Prosper Portland's fiscal year 2021 requested budget. Since we're very short on time, I'll just note that this budget was developed with broad engagement with stakeholders, including our Community Budget Committee, which began meeting on the budget in September. It also includes the Mayor's priority to coordinate on community development and to address displacement, and it incorporates cost containment and revenue generation measures in alignment with our fiscal sustainability plan. We recognize that city general fund resources are extremely limited, and on behalf of the Prosper Portland Board, I want to express our appreciation for your ongoing investment to support economic development and equitable opportunities in our community. And with that, I'll hand the presentation over to Kimberly Branham, our Executive Director. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Cruz. So good morning. We are also joined by our Economic Development Director, Tori Campbell, and our Finance Manager, Tony Barnes. So we are prepared to answer questions and look forward to this conversation. So I'm going to provide some context. Tori is going to talk about our economic development budget, and then I'm going to wrap up by touching on decision packages and some key risks. So the second slide, which says 2020 strategic plan, is helpful because it shows you both the tools that we have, which are in black. So this morning, we're going to focus in particular on our general fund portion, so the economic development part of our agency, and our business development and technical assistance, as well as our community capacity and workforce training resources. We will return in May to talk about commercial and mixed-use investments, which are supported through tax increment financing when City Council sits as our Budget Advisory Committee. Through both of these presentations, what you'll hear is our consistent focus on increasing access to quality employment, equitable wealth creation through small business ownership, strong partnerships, and healthy communities. The next slide shows why we think inclusive economic development is so important, and I'll just add that we believe that economic development is a very helpful complement to the important work of the Portland Housing Bureau and affordable housing, because we know that as people have steady employment and quality employment opportunities, that they can afford to take on some of the increased rents that we might be seeing. So we know that companies with inclusive talent practices generate 30% more revenue per employee. We know that 40% of Portland youth are BIPOC. We know that internships can be win-wins for both companies and for future employees. We know that supporting the growth and inclusion within our traded sector target industries expands higher paying employment opportunities. We know that Portland is a small business town with about 12,000 of which are owned by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and that Portland today has the 8th highest median household income in the country at $73,100. We also know that poverty rates are significantly higher and net worth is much lower for BIPOC households than for white households, both nationally and locally. Using data-driven best practices, we seek to leverage our economic assets and address the persistent racial and geographic inequities that hinder inclusive economic opportunities.
Great. Good morning, commissioners and advisory committee members. I'm going to walk you, again, my name is Tori Campbell. Make sure, okay, there we go. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tori Campbell, Director of Economic Development. I'm going to walk you through over the next few slides some of the program elements, as Kimberly has already shared, and really kind of walk you through some of the, I think, the high level, but also kind of the intricate elements with all, which shows up in all of our programming. We start with this first slide, really to illustrate that, really to do a rigorous and good economic development within our city, particularly with an emphasis on creating more widely shared prosperity. There has to be a deployment of a variety of programs and interventions, as you would imagine. What we're trying to show in this slide is showing the comprehension of it, but also show that it's also integrated, because too often we are talking about individual programs in detail and depth, but we don't fully always understand or see the continuum of services. And so this slide basically gives you that image of what are the different programs, what are the different services, even the different partnership models that are going to be necessary to literally help a startup company or a small business or someone taking a treasured family recipe and growing it into a business that they can live off of, that they can grow a family off of, and that they can even begin to employ community members within our city. And so this basically gives you that illustration. It's cute as well with the pots and the plants. You see initially micro startup neighborhood. That highlights also the integration of our department's work with the Inclusive Business Resource Network, coupled with also our traded sector business development. So the first portion of that shows who's doing that work in terms of our staff delivery and also familiarizing with some of the programs that you would imagine would show up there. I'd also calls out geography early on. So you see the Neighborhood Prosperity Network. Oftentimes, many of the businesses that we're working with would fit under this umbrella. And as those businesses, and not all desire to, but many do, we're realizing oftentimes that the barriers to growth has very little to do with the work ethic and the capacity of the entrepreneur, but it has to do with systemic racist policies and practices that have really held people back. And so a lot of our work is undoing those and creating strategies to allow for that kind of growth that we would just want to see on a much regular basis across all stripes of those who really pursue their dreams as entrepreneurs in our city. So the next one shows pre-traded sector growth. And again, you begin to see the different programs that will show up in support of that, as well as how our various teams provide work. The last slide, which is the bigger pot, you'll begin to see how that begins to infuse as a company is at a place of growth. When we say traded sector, that means growing their companies outside of the state of Oregon, so that can be both regionally, nationally, and internationally. And that's in many instances where you see the workforce component, of which I'll take a few minutes to talk about here in the next slide, really shows up in helping companies that are growing really begin to diversify their workforce, connecting them to local neighborhoods and the talent that's emerging in our city. So this is just a great slide that's trying to capture the full breadth of what we do and all of the necessary elements to it. This slide will take a few minutes, and I will be looking at my cell phone just because that's where my notes are, but I'm fully present. Just want you to know we were having some technical difficulties on the printer today, so don't assume that I'm doing anything else but respecting your time and the work that you're doing here. So the slide basically gives you an overview of how Prosper Portland, we really are investing in the workforce, which is tied to our strategic goal, which basically is working to connect target industries that that we are working with and supporting through our business development with job seekers, and also connecting them to neighborhoods as well throughout the city. And we do this primarily with a contract with Work Systems, Inc., who administrates our funding annually through 3 different programs. And I'll just take a moment to highlight the 3 programs. The first program is the Next Gen Youth Program, which focuses on youth between the ages of 16 to 24. The next program after that is familiar to you, is our Economic Opportunities Program, or EOP for short, which focuses on adult workforce development services. And then the last element of support for workforce, and again, connecting those neighborhoods and those that are seeking employment to many of our traded sector companies, will be our Workforce Navigator program, which are community-based services that are helping connect high barrier applicants and populations to these jobs that we are seeing being developed through our traded sector business development. Some of the key pieces to call out is the programs are aimed at increasing economic vitality to low-income individuals and really focusing on target populations most in need of assistance. We did have a conversation at our last time that we were able to be in front of the commissioners, and Commissioner Hardis, you talked about when we say entrepreneurs, or we talk about in particular some of the communities that oftentimes have the hardest access to jobs. We find that within the Black community, Native American community, those numbers are stubbornly double, no matter how low we are. And so we also are realizing that a lot of our focus has been working with those communities in particular, so that they also can have access to them. The next slide I wanted to share just briefly, another place of funding that we're seeking is for our Neighborhood Prosperity Network, of which you've heard. We did a presentation last week about this. And again, the major thrust of our Neighborhood Prosperity Network is community building, business development, district programming, creating opportunities for the community itself to show who they are and how they show up, but it's also really designed to help small businesses get a stronger foothold and be rooted in place within those neighborhoods, as well as community-led property development. Again, realizing that some of what we have chosen when we have identified these geographies were that they were areas of high levels of poverty, lower medium household income, lagging commercial investment, but also a higher concentration of diverse communities. And many of them actually were experiencing, when we first called out these geographies, some of the early beginnings of market forces that could potentially displace. And so the years have proven that out to be true. And so one of the key elements to the Neighborhood Prosperity Network is the ability for them to do property development. So we're glad to see that that also is beginning to show up in many of the neighborhoods. And then lastly, as an important component to this, you really can live anywhere you want to in the city if you have a job that plays a livable wage. And maybe that might be a bit of a stretch, but we all know that so much of your ability to live has so much to do with the kind of job that you have access to. And so again, having our workforce navigators really rooted in the Neighborhood Prosperity Network is an incredibly important strategy. All right. This slide gives you just the full breadth of the many resources that we call upon in order to deliver our services. We feel like this will be helpful again, just for everyone to understand that it's a mixture of general funds in many instances, community development block grants, which are federal dollars, some of our own enterprise zone dollars, cannabis as well. So this just gives you a breadth of all the programs that we've been talking about and how that breaks out. Last slide is, I will go over just briefly, will be our program offers and our anticipated outcomes for this coming year and how we've come to them over the full breadth of all of our programs. I'll start with the top one, which is going to be in our traded sector work. It's anticipated that we will have, and a lot of these numbers are coming from what we have seen year over to year over. So we have either found that this is rooted in best practice or what we can anticipate. And we've also increased the numbers, but we have seen that we have been far more successful in years past. So this is showing progression as well. So within traded sector, it's anticipated that we will be able to create 1,000 middle wage jobs through our efforts, as well as 105 companies increasing participation in public benefits agreements.
What's
really,
the time period that you're going to achieve those goals?
This will be in a fiscal year. So 1 fiscal year. And public benefits are important because that tends to provide us a stronger leverage point on helping those companies really grow their culture to be able to retain diverse talent with the public benefits agreements.
Could you give like a sentence or two explanation on what a public benefit agreement is for the listening audience who may not be as familiar?
Yeah, so a public benefits agreement, as we design it, really ends up being a suite of options that a business, when they agree to participate in our enterprise zone, which is the primary vehicle that allows for tax abatement for 5 years. So in order for you to receive this tax abatement, these are a set of things that you need to agree to that really would benefit in the sense of the word, it would benefit the public. And in this case, we know that, again, these companies are coming in oftentimes with really strong employment opportunities. And so we want to make sure that if these companies are nestled in neighborhoods or in communities, that those community members should have access to those jobs. And so that is an agreement. And so that would mean maybe there's a percentage of hires that they would do in the neighborhood. But for many of the companies, it's also an agreement also to find ways to do culture change within their company as a whole so that they're not only recruiting, but they're also able to retain those diverse employees, as we know that both of those are incredibly important. So that's an example.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The next area I'll focus on is our Inclusive Business Resource Network, and we anticipate that this coming fiscal year, we will be able to serve through our network providers, a wonderful network of providers, 850 businesses, small businesses led by entrepreneurs of color as well as women, and that 75% of them will be people of color that will be served. When we do the math over the course of 5 years, which is what this program has been designed for, it would mean potentially that we would be able to serve about 10 to 20% of all diverse businesses who call Portland home. So that's actually an important number to call out just in terms of our ability to scale and the magnitude of supports and strengthening the overall vitality and know-how of small businesses that are being led by business leaders and innovators within our Black and Indigenous and other communities of color. The next area is our Neighborhood Prosperity Network. Again, just highlighting some of the outcomes that we're anticipating in the coming fiscal year. It'll be a mixture of both dollars leveraged as a result of the investment that they're receiving, net businesses added to the overall network. So we're not counting existing businesses, but businesses being added, so it's an additive number, as well as just the overall volunteerism. I think that's always important to call out, knowing that so much of what drives the neighborhoods is the level of connectedness from the neighbors themselves and them feeling a sense of belonging and participation in this work, particularly with economic development opportunities. Lastly is workforce development, is that we believe that over the fiscal year coming, we'll have roughly 2,000 participate in terms of being served through the 3 programs that I've mentioned, the Next Gen, the adult workforce, as well as our workforce navigators, that 60% of the adults will actually move to matriculate into employment, and that 65% participants will be those of color, which is an important number to continue to call out, knowing that the thorny and really stubborn numbers tend to be within communities of color, and particularly the Black and Native American communities. And lastly, that 65% of the youth will also advance into employment opportunities and post-secondary training. Again, showing that it's not just a momentary experience, but that the trainings and the support they receive are actually moving them into employment. And so these are our anticipated outcomes for this coming year within our budget ask.
So Tori just walked through our ongoing program offers. So without any decision package, those would be the anticipated outcomes. I want to highlight the 2 additional decision packages that we haven't yet talked about. So earlier this week, we spoke to the cannabis requests. Most of those were ongoing. Just this morning, we talked about the community development mitigating displacement request, which is, as was mentioned, maybe a 3-year one-time request. The Portland Harbor Cleanup and the Portland Film Office are intended to be one-time requests. So I'll just share briefly. Prosper Portland's share of citywide contribution to the Portland Harbor Restoration Trust is estimated at about 8%. 60% of those properties fall within the River District and the Willamette Industrial TIF District, while the other 40% were purchased with funds that no longer exist. And so we are, given the restrictions on the use of tax increment finance, we are asking for general fund resources to address those kind of orphan properties, the portion that is no longer within a tax increment finance district. We're also working with the city attorney to understand how we can make sure that the use of River District funds and Willamette Industrial TIF district funds would be used in a TIF eligible way. I'll probably need my attorney to talk in any more detail about that, but I'm happy to try to answer questions on the Superfund Harbor Restoration Trust. We're also asking for one-time funding for the Portland Film Office, which continues to work with partners towards being self-sustainable. The creation of the new fee structure will be implemented in July with centralized permitting function then. The program currently is responsible for an average of $290,000 in permit revenue to parks and transportation. The Portland Film Office presence in the city permit allows us to maintain a 3-day turnaround time, which is the industry standard in their work. And by attending to the short-term needs of the film production, we are also able to reinvest into the local film industry through a post-production grant program. We have workforce development efforts. We support Outside the Frame and other related nonprofits, as well as a talent diversity initiative, because film industry jobs actually tend to be middle wage employment opportunities, and so we want to make sure that even as they can be seasonal or episodic, that they are quality and inclusive opportunities. In fiscal year 18-19, there was about $170 million and nearly 3,000 jobs associated with productions statewide. 95% of those are within the city of Portland. So
I have a question on that. And did you say that $290,000 was collected by PBOT for permits?
That's an average over the 5 years. About $289,000 has gone to parks and transportation each year over the 5-year period.
So I'd like to have a better breakdown, because I think if PBOT is making money, why should the general fund be fully funding the film office again? I remember last year it was another one-time.
Yep.
We're going to have a plan, and the plan will be in place, and here we are again with another one-time. We got a plan, and the plan will be in place.
Yep.
What's changed between last year when we were told that and this year?
Yeah.
And how can I expect that next year we won't have the same conversation?
Yes. So we share in disappointment that we don't have a self-sustaining program at this point. A couple things have happened. One is both parks and transportation, though they have permit revenue, they do have to make sure that there are safety considerations, and that there are resources to support the Parks Bureau more broadly. And so I think our partners within those agencies really want to continue to make sure that for the permit functions that they are doing related to the Portland Film Office, that they're still in a cost recovery mode, because this is not an elegant analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway, which is I think sometimes of the Portland Film Office as like a wedding planner. It's the person who's done it a lot. They know who to call and they can get it quickly. And it's a very positive experience for the film production. But there's still somebody who has to cater. There's still somebody who's doing the other work. And so in this function, PBOT and Parks still have to put forward the permit, even though as the Portland Film Office, we're making that experience excellent for the film production. And so there are a couple things that we've looked at. One is to, by having this omnibus permitting function, we will be increasing the permit revenue, or the permit revenue. And the industry is willing to do that because they want to see this support. And so we're hoping that that will help to offset the general fund once that centralized permit function goes into place. We also had anticipated that we might have a partnership with Travel Portland, and unfortunately that hasn't happened yet this year. So I think we are looking for what are those compilations of funds that we could put together to have it be a self-sustaining office.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And, I know, I have no doubt at the good work they do, but when people tell me it's one time, I actually expect it to only be one time. And so when it comes back over and over again, of course, we as a council will have to decide whether or not it's fully funded. What happens if it's not fully funded? Does that mean the office closes down or we no longer do films?
I think that if we don't receive the $142,000, we will not have resources for the FTE, and effectively that is what supports this function. It is a staff person who is every day working with the industry, seen as part of the industry in many ways, is a known presence. So I mean, we would see what the other alternatives are, but I would anticipate that if we don't receive these fundings, that yes, the film office would probably close.
And explain to me again why the city would pay Prosper Portland's portion of the Portland Harbor cleanup?
Okay, so my understanding is that there are a number of sort of remnant or orphan properties purchased by bureaus that no longer exist. And while Prosper Portland is an overall agency, each of our funds is distinct. So the River District is its own fund and can only be used for functions within the River District or associated staffing costs. So for those funds, like there was a St. John's Urban Renewal District, we no longer have resources. That TIF district has been closed for decades. And so it's basically an orphan property. We can't use our existing resources to pay for that cleanup.
So I think that's a bigger question for the council. It's like how many city bureaus are going to be asking the general fund to pick up their fair share of what they are responsible for paying. So that will be an ongoing conversation, but I thank you for your answer.
Yep, understood.
Other questions?
I'd just like to say that I'm very interested in the film office conversation and have been for the past 3 years. It's an issue that Commissioner Fish and I have both tried to make some progress on. And while I share disappointment that we haven't gotten to that place of self-sustaining that we want, I do want to point out that this is a pretty great return on investment for the city of Portland. And the film industry does generate a significant amount of economic activity, considering how little we do for them relative to other cities. Portland's a really attractive place for the industry, and I think with a little bit of help, we could attract more. Of course, we need to have a conversation about how much more we want to attract, because it creates, impacts for our residents, and we want to carefully weigh the benefits and adverse effects. But Just please keep me in the loop.
Thank you. We will-
Yeah, I want
will
to
do.
support that too. That,
Okay.
It's very clear that since other jurisdictions offer incentives and assistance, this is necessary and it does provide good jobs.
Thank you. So, like the Housing Bureau, we were asked to talk about some of the key risks or notable trends. And we put this slide together a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, the economic slowdown, which was something that we,
I'm sorry.
oh, please.
I think
Oh, I apologize.
Andrea had, or Kim, okay.
Thank you, I'm sorry, I didn't see. Unfortunately, the risk of an economic slowdown, I think, is higher than it was when we put the slide together a few weeks ago, given the health challenges that we are now facing. But so just want to note a few risks and challenges that have both revenue and service level impact. So an economic slowdown would have impact both on the need for programming. In the last recession, we saw significant increased desire for employment services as well as for support for small businesses and even more moderate-sized traded sector businesses, as well as a significant impact to the enterprise zone, which is a funding source which supports a lot of our programs. There continues to be uncertainty about community development block grant dollars at the federal level, and so that continues to be a risk. And just as for the Portland Housing Bureau, Prosper Portland is looking at the impact of the TIF cliff. And even if general fund and other resources remain flat or grow at a slow pace, existing TIF resources will be spent down over the next 5 or so years, leaving a gap in funding to continue to support a portion of our economic development activities. We do have a financial sustainability plan. We update it regularly, and that relies on a diversified funding source or funding sources to sustain staffing and programmatic activity. What you see here in these two slides, so on the right-hand side, we have forecasted economic development staffing, and just like all other public servants, we see increased staff costs, and we are also anticipating a reduction in forecasted funding. So you see that gap that we will need to solve for between the orange line and the blue line. If we do not solve for it between now and the next 10 to 15 years, we anticipate that we will be able to serve about half of the businesses and workforce development needs that we currently do.
I also suspect your mission may change a bit based on your budget and the resources that you have available.
That is also accurate, yeah.
Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. My question had to do with the film office, and it's just a clarification. Do movie companies, whoever's coming in, do they actually pay for that service at the film office? Or there's no charge to
No,
use the film office?
Do you want to speak to the details of that?
There's somebody coming. Come, please.
Yeah, so they do pay the general fees associated with getting a transportation or a park permit. What we are suggesting by having this centralized function is that there would be a premium associated with getting this kind of concierge service.
Of course.
Right now, that there will be a ramp-up phase for the collection of that, so we think that will generate about $70,000 in this first year, but that doesn't bridge the gap in terms of having an FTE that is fully funded.
I guess I'm just surprised that that hasn't just been the case all along.
Hello, Charles Adrian, Business and Industry Manager for Prosper Portland. Hello, Commissioners, Advisory Committee members. Executive Director Branham did a fantastic job answering the question. That is entirely the case. We are anticipating about $70,000 long-term in revenue coming from a surcharge placed on the industry, specifically to support the film.
I can
office
barely
support.
hear you.
Oh,
Can
I'm
you
sorry.
either move that mic closer or, yeah. It's on.
It is on.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, that was better. Well, the short answer to the question is Executive Director Branham answered perfectly. We are anticipating about a $70,000 long-term funding stream that would come from the imposition of a surcharge on the industry to basically for this concierge service that the film office provides.
So why are we not able to cover our expenses with the fees that we charge for the service, like we do for most everything else at the city?
Yeah, so I think when we looked at the sensitivity of what they would pay,
Bring it a little closer,
oh,
Kimberly.
I'm sorry, okay. When we looked at the sensitivity of what they would be willing to pay, we pegged it at something that we thought the film production companies could absorb. We have also been in negotiations with Transportation and Parks because there was an initial understanding that some portion of the permits that currently go, permit fees that go to Parks and Transportation would go to the film office. That's not currently what's proposed. So I think we just need to figure out how to close that delta, if it's through Travel Portland, if it's through general fund and moving things internally around, or whether how we close for that.
So again, just curious if we've looked at how other states and cities are handling the issue, and is what we're doing the same as what they're doing?
There is a wide range of options or a wide range of ways to pay for this. Candidly, the most other cities will pay for this through either the lodging or associated taxes, or in many places you're also seeing sales taxes, which is obviously not an option here. And so only in very, very few locations are we actually seeing permit fees supporting the film in the film office, because it's a competitive advantage to keep them as low as possible, particularly for smaller productions where permit fees can actually absorb quite a lot of their resources.
Are there other public resources that come into play when films are being done in the city of Portland? So my question is basically, are we paying additional money because we now need police and we need other transportation vehicles and we need other stuff? What are we really paying in real costs?
I think so. The best answer to that question would probably come from the affected bureaus because they've done their own analyses around what the actual cost is relative to what they're taking in, because they set the permit revenue or the permit fees individually. But yes, there is a permit associated with police. So police also receives some permit fees. The OMF receives a little bit. And obviously are also non-city entities like Metro and TriMet also charge to some extent for whenever film productions are working on their property or interacting with them.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. So on the summary document, on the backside, is there a place where it's maybe disaggregated a little bit? I appreciate the percentage of startup investments led by people of color and women, but I wonder if there's a place where you have something specifically that talks about women of color. And then same kind of disaggregation by race and gender, ideally both, in the quality jobs in the workforce data. So that's one piece. And then another piece is, it looks like a part of your strategic plan is equitable wealth creation. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more. I understand that part of that is investment in small business capital, but beyond that, what are some of the tools that you're looking to implement to incentivize and create equitable wealth creation? Because I know there was some focus, and I appreciate it, on the need for income equity, which is really important. But like the numbers around wealth inequity show that Black and Indigenous and Latino women have like a fraction of 1% of wealth compared to every dollar of wealth owned by white men. So I just kind of wonder where you're focusing more program energy there.
Yeah, great questions. And thanks for putting attention on the key performance measures. We wanted to augment it because it's kind of jarring to see 0% in 2020 as the target. So if I might just explain, what we were tracking in terms of percentage of startup investments to firms founded, owned, or led by people of color and those led by women were associated first with the Inclusive Startup Fund, which was a one-time infusion of resources that we received through City Council and created a fund specifically to support startup funds founded by people of color with a focus on women as well. So we definitely have that information disaggregated. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we can get that back to you. We did have specific targets for African American, Latino, and indigenous populations within our contract, so we can get that information, certainly. The question in terms of the percentage of workforce in Multnomah County with quality jobs, that one, we could probably do some analysis to be able to disaggregate by people of color, and in particular, so what we do, though, is we're looking at those jobs that pay at least $42,000 a year that don't require a bachelor's degree, and so we can find that out. To your question of wealth creation, certainly for the Economic Development Department, our primary focus is to support small businesses, particularly businesses led by BIPOC founders. I think we can talk a little bit about, so I think Tori mentioned that about 75% of people who participate in the Inclusive Business Resource Network identify as people of color, and about 58% are women founders. So we can look at that information as well.
Are there, because you were presenting before with the various kind of housing entities too, so I wonder if there are efforts afoot around housing equity access also.
Yeah.
So, Kimberly, I'm going to
Please.
allow you to answer this last question. Unfortunately, we're going to have to move on because we got one more. All right.
Yeah. So we have invested some of our tax increment finance resources into the Portland Housing Bureau because our resources can help increase the income level requirements. So the Housing Bureau has, through the set-aside policy, needs to maintain home ownership support at 0 to 80% of area media income. Our resources in Northeast Portland, for example, augment that to go from 80 to 120%, acknowledging that particularly for African American population, which is the focus in North and Northeast, the wealth gap is the hindrance as much as the income gap is. And so we wanted to make sure, and given the housing prices in Northeast. So we do have partnerships with the Housing Bureau, but we do really rely on them to be the leader in terms of supporting home ownership, given their expertise and their focus.
Thank you so much. We greatly appreciate all the good information.
Commissioner, could I just ask Jessica, I sent a long list of
Yes.
questions. I'm not asking you them now. And I'll probably send a few more after this discussion.
Yes, please,
get
send them to
answered.
Jessica, and she'll make sure to get the answers to all of us. Thank you.
So, Council, we have a choice right now. Because of the situation with COVID was sort of evolving rapidly yesterday, I asked Director Jolin if he might be able to give an abbreviated presentation if we needed to leave early. But if everybody here is interested in retaining, we now have 45 minutes, as we had scheduled to have Director Jolin speak. But, you know, I had talked about trying to get us out around noon or 12:15 if folks have commitments. So I know everybody's very busy, and this is obviously a really important presentation, but I just wanted to, and we were scheduled to have a little bit of a break right now, but we can keep rolling if people want to get out earlier.
So before we move to that discussion, I want to apologize to all the folks who presented this morning. I've been utterly distracted by the COVID declarations and the apparent plan to continue having the meeting this afternoon. And despite you've put out a notice saying that meetings over 25 people are cancelled, but we apparently are moving forward with the residential infill project meeting this afternoon. So could you please clarify what's happening?
Madam Chairman, would you like to take the time to have this conversation now?
I guess, so the answer is yes. The plan is to continue on. We have a plan about how many people we'll let into the chamber. We have 4 overflow rooms for people who will show up. As of this moment, there is nothing that's compelling us to not to change anything on today's agenda.
For the record, as a healthcare professional, I think that is utterly irresponsible, and I will have some conversations with
I
parents.
would suggest we actually have this conversation offline.
I agree.
I don't think we should have this argument in public right here in the middle of a budget work session. I
But
will
we
need to
also-
leave at noon.
Excellent. I want to respect Mark Jolin. He's been very patient being here all morning. And if it pleases the rest of my crew, I'd rather just keep going. Come on up.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, I will turn it over to Director Jolin.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Mark Jolin, Director of Juvenile Homeless Services for the City of Portland, Multnomah County. Is this mic working?
Press the button.
Got it.
Hey,
Now it's
there you
working.
go.
Thank you. And this is Christian Elkin, who is our Budget Director in the Joint Office and soon to be the county's Budget Director. Thank you for joining us. So can I just, for my own sake, how much time should I anticipate that I have before the meeting breaks up?
I'm thinking a half hour. I think all of us have read through the documents and probably have questions, so as abbreviated but thorough as you can be would be fabulous.
All right, I will go quickly. So thank you for having us this morning. How do I advance the slides? Great. So we always start with our vision, which is that no one should be homeless. Everyone needs a safe, stable place to call home. It's the vision that is driving all of the work that we do in the Joint Office every single day. We always want to start with a little bit of discussion about need, what it is that is driving what we're experiencing in our shelters, on our streets. And it is, as it has been for many years now, first and foremost, the failure of our housing market and the growing divide between what people have available to them in income and what it costs to rent. This is some of the most recent data showing that we're short in our community about 30,000 units of housing that is affordable to people who are extremely low income, so making 30% of the area median income or less. The next slide illustrates how the current cost of housing compares to what people have as income. And where we see and continue to see the greatest challenge is with people who are on fixed incomes, whether it's supplemental security income that is still under $800 a month, Social Security retirement income, or a veteran's benefit. As you can see in the lower left-hand corner chart, the difference between what someone on one of those fixed incomes has total available to them in annual income as compared to what they would need to be able to afford even a one-bedroom apartment in our community. We're seeing the cost of our 60% AMI affordable housing now be entirely out of reach for people who are on Social Security or on SSI. I've shared with you before that just in Multnomah County, we have over 20,000 individuals whose principal source of income is SSI, which is that amount that's under $800 a month. What that looks like numerically, we did our point-in-time count in January of 2019, provided that report out to the community this spring. We identified 4,020 people who met the HUD homeless definition. Many of you are aware that that is not inclusive of folks who are doubled up, living involuntarily doubled up, so it's people who are outside in shelter in transitional housing. That was actually a 4% reduction as compared to 2 years ago, and we saw some progress in some communities. But where we saw a continued significant growth is within the chronic homeless population. We had 1,770 people who we could confirm were chronically homeless. Those are folks who have been outside for a year or more, had multiple episodes of homelessness, and are suffering with one or more significant disabling conditions. That number was up 37%, which I'll show you in a moment. As we think about need, because, as I've shared with you before, fundamentally the number of people who are on the streets or in our shelters on any given night is the difference between how many people become homeless over a given period of time as compared to the number of people who move out. I'll talk a lot about the number of folks we assisted to get out of homelessness and houselessness last year, but one measure that we have of how many people became homeless, and this is only one measure last year, is this number of people who showed up for the first time in the last 2 years seeking services. We had 5,410 people who sought services in our system for the first time. We also know that about 1,200 people who had exited the homeless service system in 2017 returned back to our system at some point over the subsequent 2 years.
Do you know why?
I can't disaggregate that for you. I don't have it with me. We have some indication from our providers that in most cases the returns to homelessness are a function of the fact that their income ran out. Whatever limited duration support we were able to provide wasn't enough. In some cases, folks will lose their housing because of behavioral challenges that they may have in their space, but that's a place where those folks are more commonly in supportive housing. Our retention rates in supportive housing are well over 90%. So it's more likely that it's folks who lost the income that they had.
Would love to have those details, so if you could send it to Jessica, she
Yeah,
could
we
send it
will,
to us.
we will see what we can pull together for you. If we look specifically at the chronic population, I'm not sure, am I? Nope. You're doing it, okay. Okay, can you go back?
Oh, that's
Thank you. I thought I was mentally causing them to
That's
move
teamwork,
somehow. It's so
teamwork.
good. Can you then go back? Can I wish it back? That's perfect. So the chronic homeless population, again, about 1,770 people who were able to confirm. And to be clear, confirm means we survey them and we get the confirmation. The number is likely to be higher than that. It was a 37% overall increase. It was a 48% increase in the unsheltered population. And one of the challenges with our chronic population is that they are disproportionately unsheltered, and they are an even faster growing portion of the unsheltered population. It is also the case that we saw very high rates of increase among communities of color. The rate of increase among the Native American population was not as high, but they already had the highest percentage rate. Over 50% of the Native population meets the chronic homeless definition. And then we saw faster growth in the African American and Latinx populations than in the overall chronic homeless population. So one of the things that we know right now is that the chronically homeless population is increasingly overrepresented within communities of color. In terms of the disabling conditions, this gives you a sense of the types of disabling conditions folks reported living with here. There are very high rates of mental health and addiction disorders, self-identified. So this is what people will reveal to us in the surveys. Also very high rates of physical disability. About a third of the population self-identified as having both a mental health and an addiction disorder simultaneously, so co-occurring disorders.
So I think this is an important data point because we get into this battle constantly about everybody's mentally ill, everybody's on substance abuse. And so this is based on someone saying to you that they are suffering from some mental health issue.
Yes.
There's no medical diagnosis, there's no treatment plan. This is just a conversation with a service provider.
With a survey taker, and this is only the chronic population. So 1,770 out of the 4,000, right? So you're at about 40-something% there, and of that, by definition, in order to meet that definition, you have to identify as having a disabling condition. But you're correct, Commissioner. This is not verified by a doctor. This is what people share with us in conversation.
Thank you, because I think people get confused and they use this data as facts of this is people on the street because of these reasons, and I appreciate that clarification.
Absolutely. So that is a very quick snapshot of need. There are many other ways to think about it and talk about it. I want to now look at the kind of overall capacity of our homeless response system. What we've provided, and we've discussed this before, we essentially have three strategies, two of which are actually about ending people's homelessness. That's prevention, preventing it from happening in the first place, and then moving people out of homelessness and houselessness back into permanent housing is the other. Shelter plays a role in this in terms of providing basic safety to individuals and a stable platform from which to engage in the services that they need to get back into housing. But as long as someone is still in shelter, they are still experiencing homelessness, and that's important to keep in mind. We don't anticipate big expansions in capacity. We'll talk about our budget, but essentially we're not looking at adding large amounts of additional capacity this year just based on the available resources. So we expect that last year's measures are likely to be about where we land this year again. There are a lot of things that will influence that, but preventions, we expect to be able to serve about 7,400 new individuals with prevention services. We expect to be able to help about 6,000 people move out of homelessness and back into permanent housing. And we're looking to maintain the 1,450 year-round shelter beds across the system. That's for adults, DV survivors, youth, and families, and also maintain 300 beds of winter shelter capacity going into next year. One of the critical measures of outcomes that we are tracking is how many new people get placement and retention services each year, right? So this is about how many people can we move out and keep out of homelessness over the course of time. I wanted to illustrate for you the evolution of our sort of point in time, the number of people we're able to keep in housing over the course of a given year as it's evolved from FY15 to FY19. You can see overall a 39% increase there for all populations. Importantly, that tracks pretty well the increases in expenditures that the city and the county have made towards this work. We put up here the PIT data. There are a lot of limitations to the point-in-time count data. There are many ways in which we're not able to get to everybody. Again, it doesn't include folks who are doubled up, but it is a reference point for you. So you can see in terms of people of color served, and I have that data disaggregated by different communities, of course. The PIT data tells us that about 38% of the HUD homeless population identifies as a person of color, and about 61% of the people who were able to help into housing identified as people of color last year. About 54% were disabled. That's lower than in the point-in-time count. This is a reflection of the fact that we're serving a lot of families, and you'll see the rates of disability among families is lower. And then in terms of age, 55 plus, about 20% of those moved into housing were 55 plus. We see a higher number than that in the HUD homeless population, again, largely because families are significantly undercounted there because they're doubled up primarily. In terms of equity, we spoke about this last year. We do a lot to disaggregate using inclusive identities, all of both our access data at a provider level, sort of program by program, and then at the system level to understand how different communities of color that are overrepresented in the homeless population are accessing different types of services, and then how they're doing in those services. Are they seeing the same kinds of success rates? This is one summary measure where we look at the rates of different communities of color in the HUD homeless population as a percentage, and compare that to what percentage of the housing placements that those different communities are benefiting from. And so what you can see here is that the overrepresented communities of color in the HUD point-in-time count, with all of its limitations, are being served at the rate or higher rates than they show up in the point-in-time count data. So again, it's one measure. There are many ways this could be unpacked, but wanted to share that with you here. The next slides I'm just going to run through quickly because we've disaggregated for you. One of the important things, often the Joint Office, when folks think about homelessness, they think narrowly about the chronically homeless population or the adult population. We're, of course, serving all kinds of different households that are experiencing different forms of homelessness over the course of a year. And our systems are organized into population-specific systems. So we have a family system, a DV system, a youth system. So we pulled data, and what you can see here is that in adult-only households, we've seen a 33% increase since FY15, and we're tracking well in terms of the racial and ethnic composition of the adult-only population and who's being served. We are also serving a lot of folks with disabilities in the adult-only household population, and that's consistent with what we see in the point-in-time count data, and also a large percentage of people who are over 55. So flipping through, here you see similar data for families, and again, we seem to be tracking pretty well with the need data, and also seeing proportionate increases in numbers of people in family served. We use the same scale, so this line looks flat, but it's not. This is for youth-only households, and this is 24 and under. And again, we've seen about a 36% increase in the number of youth who've moved into permanent housing annually over the last 5 years. And then finally, domestic violence survivors. Here we've actually seen a really significant increase in the number of housing placements that system's been able to achieve with some additional federal funding and a good amount of additional local funding as well. Here, I'm not putting up point-in-time count data because the point-in-time count does not capture domestic violence well at all. Similarly with the youth data, it's not helpful to provide it as a comparison. All right, and the last slide here is supportive housing. I think did you have the Housing Bureau come and talk to you earlier, talk about their supportive housing work? So I assumed they would, and I didn't provide a lot on supportive housing, but obviously we've been fully invested in partnering with them to expand. I am hopeful that when we look at this number a couple of years from now, it will be substantially higher, but we have continued to expand the number of people who are in supportive housing.
So somebody just stopped me on the street this week and asked me this question. Is there any housing affordable for folks who have formerly been convicted of sex offenses?
We have some housing that is dedicated to that population, and our providers work very hard to help folks who have sex offenses on their records to find housing in the community. So there's nothing that prevents us from serving those folks with our local resources. and that can be a real challenge to find a landlord who is willing to rent. So the answer is there's a lot of housing work happening for those people, and it's very hard. And so we do see a disproportionate number of folks continuing to experience homelessness and be homeless for longer periods of time if they do have sex offenses.
I had a gentleman ask me this week, so is the community safer with me in a house or living on the street? And my answer would be with you in a house, right? And I'm happy to see that you are going to be investing money in housing for trans youth. And I know I'm jumping a little ahead, but just wanted you to know that I am very appreciative that that is taking place. I know that we talk about leading with race, right? But we cannot lead with race without understanding the impact that the criminal justice system has had on some members of our population. So what has been your experience in this work, especially over the last year or so, or 2 years, or a few years, at really being intentional about, there's a reason why some people have a lot of felonies on their record, and some people have none, and it may not have anything to do with their individual actions.
Yep. So I talked about the impact of the housing market, but for communities of color, the ongoing racism that people face in every institution, including the criminal justice system and the housing market and the employment market, is causing more people of color to become homeless. That's why we see the overrepresentation, and it's also making it that much harder to get out. And the experience of communities of color in our criminal justice system is one of those. So, in terms of being able to respond to that, both understanding that dynamic, we've done some investing in reentry programs. We invest in Flip the Script, which is it's focused on African Americans coming out of the criminal justice system, a reentry program. But a lot of it is investing in culturally specific services where there is an understanding of the ways in which those dynamics are playing out for the community, and the advocacy strategies are in place to help folks overcome that. And so, we've got investments on every one of our systems, and actually we'll see one of our priorities for the coming year is to make more investments in culturally specific service providers to serve adult-only households, because again, we saw such a surge in chronic homelessness for communities of color, and it is the area where we have, relatively speaking, the smallest level of investment. So we want to correct for that right now.
I just want to appreciate Commissioner Hardesty for bringing up this issue. It's one of great interest to me as a survivor of violent crime who went through the process of having my attacker paroled and realized how we are setting him and hundreds or thousands of other formerly incarcerated folks up for failure to reenter community. And my safety and all of our safety depends on people being able to succeed in community. It's a conversation we're absolutely failing at, because no one wants to live next door to an ex-offender. Well, guess what? You do live next door to ex-offenders.
That's right.
Already, and many of the people that we see living on the streets have some kind of criminal justice involvement, and that is one of many barriers they face to housing. It's something that I aim to solve through through the low barrier screening criteria, which is fact, not fear-based, but I have, it's voluntary, so we don't know what kind of impact it could have. I hope that some people see the value in safe, stable housing for everyone to our whole community. So thank you for that work.
Absolutely. So we were asked to speak about our equity accomplishments. In our office, we have externally focused equity work that we do. We support within A Home for Everyone the equity committee that ensures that an equity lens is brought to every planning discussion that we have within A Home for Everyone, the budget prioritization processes that we engage A Home for Everyone for. And then we also in our office are very actively engaged with our contractors around their own implementation of racial equity strategies. So we have the expectation in all of our procurements and in our contracts that our providers are providing culturally specific services or are providing culturally responsive services. They are expected to have equity plans. They are expected to provide equity reports, so we're able to monitor their progress towards the plans they put in place. And our equity manager who we brought on about a year and a half ago, is specifically focused on supporting our community-based providers in that work. So there's a good deal going on that's external facing, and then internally, the county, as you know, has been involved in a workforce equity strategic planning process, and we have our own internal equity working group. We're bringing culturally specific sort of KSAs into our job descriptions and really sort of building out our internal infrastructure to ensure that we're achieving racial equity in the office and the ways in which we are sort of organized and work together as a team. So there's a lot there. I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to ask more questions or answer questions if you have them.
So before you move on to the budget, I want to echo what my colleagues did with affordable housing. Well done. We are making progress. We need to be able to tell that story a lot more widely. And so it was really impressive to see the demographic breakdowns, the improvement over time. And I was very encouraged to hear you say we just need to keep doing what we're doing. Well, you didn't say it quite like that, but that's what you've been saying for quite some time, is that we need to do as much as it takes for as long as it takes, and it is making results. And I know that it's extremely exhausting work, so thank you.
Thank you.
Here, here. Gosh, I just had one more question and it just went right totally out of my head. But it's all good.
I'll
I'm having a
step in
senior
and you
moment.
can- yeah.
Okay. I'll do the Frida thing and just have something to drink while it comes back.
I mean, I can hold my questions to the end, or shall I?
Oh,
ask them
he's
now?
almost done.
Well,
He's going to
I've
get
got
into the
slides, but
budget.
I'll go quickly through the
Okay.
budget. If you've all read it,
So-
and I don't need to.
Mark, as you know, I've been kind of very hesitant to talk about this particular issue in public, and so before I say it, I want to make it clear. When people show up in Multnomah County or in the city of Portland who need our help, it's our obligation to help them.
Yeah.
That being said, we know that because of a lack of services and support in the metro region and across the state, that many people, many Oregonians are coming to Portland for help. And again, I am not going to fault anyone for fighting to survive. However, I'm wondering if we do have stats on last known addresses and how many people are coming from outside of Multnomah County to access our services. And that is simply because we're looking at this regional homeless measure, and we really need our neighbors to step up and serve their community members or contribute to the costs that we are bearing as the service provider for a lot of the region.
So I didn't come prepared with
That's all right.
data on that. We have some limited data. It's a little bit imperfect because of how data is collected on this
Yeah.
question, but it is something that we've been asked, and for some of the reasons you identified, have been delving into a little more deeply. It has been the case that Clackamas and Washington County comparatively don't have the investments in, especially on the adult system side, that we do. And so we're aware, and I think they are too, that folks needing shelter and then the attendant housing transition services that get connected to shelter are often coming here for that kind of support. I appreciate you saying that we want to support folks if they come here and have a need. And I think without saying anything one way or the other about the measure, as I understand it, part of the expectation were it to pass is that there would be resources put specifically into that kind of regional planning that would allow us to both understand how people are flowing across county lines better, where it makes sense to make sort of specific types of investments in different parts of the region to meet need. So you'll see that one of our priorities is, out of necessity, to begin planning for the eventuality should this measure pass, and part of that planning will be some of that thinking about how to work with our partners at Washington Clackamas County in the planning phase to be able to address some of that.
And then I just have another quick request, and I said something similar earlier, just really wanting us to do a better job communicating with the public about what we are doing, because we have made significant progress. What would be very useful to me, and I think helpful to the public to understand, would be just a year-to-year kind of comparison of the outcomes over the life of the joint office, as far as, you know, the numbers, how many people we kept in housing, how many people we got housed.
Okay.
And I think an overlay with rent increases would be really interesting because we know that there is a huge correlation between rent increases and homelessness. So and population growth.
And population growth.
So
Okay.
just a simple little infographic, but really we need to start grappling with the full picture. We are trying to address a crisis and throwing resources in a variety of places, but not many people in our community understand the full picture of our crisis. And again, I just think if we're going to get support for anything that we need to do, people have to have a better grasp of what we are actually dealing with.
Right. I did
I-
remember my question.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Were you statement or question?
I mean, just you can follow up, but,
Yeah, no, I think the challenges around, so you did approve a communications position, a shared position with the Housing Bureau and the Joint Office in this year's budget. We have a request in this budget for a community engagement position, which is a complement to that for this very reason, that we're both not able to get the message out, but also not necessarily able to take advantage of all the opportunities that come to us, because we have a lot of folks coming forward wanting to help.
Yes.
And absent someone who can sort of prioritize having those conversations, figuring out how to fit them in, we've struggled to really take advantage of those invitations or opportunities that are presented, so.
Cool, thanks.
I think that's one of the exciting things about where most Portlanders are. They really want to help, right? And if we are better at being able to identify how the public could be helpful, even if we just had a checklist to say, here's some things that you can do on your own or in your neighborhood or with your faith institution, I think would help a whole lot, right? I think when people don't know what to do is when they get frustrated, because if in their neighborhood they're not seeing any real change, right? The assumption is that nothing's happening. So I absolutely agree with that. I did remember my question, which is, we are now focused on culturally specific organizations, and I can think of maybe 5. There may be more. Some have the expertise for the work that we want them to do. Some have no history in doing that work. And there are some culturally responsive organizations who have consistently shown really good results with organizations, even if the people don't look like them. I am very concerned that we are adopting language that implies that we have many more community resources than we really have. And if we're not careful, we will be overburdening organizations who are already overburdened, who are already overcommitted to public engagement processes, and we will not, in fact, be getting the information or the assistance that we say we want. And so I'm a fan of services that work for the individual, but the individual should decide who that service provider is, and not government deciding that one service provider would be better for one population than another.
I share your concerns about the capacity of our culturally specific providers. There is a lot being asked of a small number of organizations, and that is something that we're in constant discussion with them about. And to the extent that they are interested in coming into new spaces or lines of business, we're trying to provide support for that, understanding that that comes with resource needs. And you're absolutely right. We have a lot of organizations that we're supporting in being culturally responsive. And our goal is always choice, right? So we want folks to have a range of options. So it will not be us dictating that a particular individual needs to go to one organization or another. A good example of this is in coordinated access for supportive housing. We have a number of culturally specific providers. One of the assessment questions is, do you feel that you would benefit from or would like culturally specific services? If someone says yes, then we try to honor that. If they say no, then we still give them whatever choice comes up first. But it's absolutely about providing folks a range of options and choice. And as we look at the possibility of new resources coming into the system, talking to all of our providers about what it's going to mean to scale, what they're going to need administratively, and it is going to be central to that conversation.
Yes, and I will add one more thing, Mark. I think it's also important to figure out what's missing and whether we have an opportunity to help build a community organization that actually will be directly serving the community that we keep saying that we want to engage, right? Because yes, I'm concerned that we're going to burn people out, and then we're going to lose organizations because they just will be overwhelmed with all the governmental requests that they're receiving. Questions?
A comment, because I happen to serve on the Home for Everyone board, and we have had discussions on getting the information out, and it's been suggested, we have the new communication person, but to focus a little more in our public entity, and school districts are the same, we're used to communicating, throwing out numbers or data or whatever, that it might behoove us as public entities to think about the PR that private sector does, or the marketing. We're not talking bonds or anything, we're going after money, we're providing information, but could it have a better bent that would attract our technology savvy population now that they're looking for the bells and whistles that'll catch their attention? The other thing in regard to the smaller communities, we had a discussion, it's been quite a while ago, but also could those, you have your main organizations who tend to get funded, smaller organizations don't have the expertise that possibly they could start doing similar to what our school district have done with a lot of our nonprofits and stuff, is collaborate together, because one has the expertise and then not have to double pay administration, but they could support each other.
So,
Any other questions? Take it away, Mark.
all right, so I'll go quickly through the budget. The guiding values of A Home for Everyone continue to be the guiding values of our work. On the next page, we go through a very extensive multi-month process of engaging through A Home for Everyone with subcommittees, with our community partners. We put a survey out to some 800 people who are on the list, asking them to weigh in. We asked them very high-level questions, sort of, if we had to make a reduction, what would you protect? If there were opportunity for new funding, what would you add? Those kinds of things, because we're always so early in the process, we don't have any budget guidance. What you see on this slide are the things that sort of coalesced, that the Home for Everyone Coordinating Board coalesced around in terms of guidance. And sort of as what you see here is the continuous emphasis on our racial equity focus and the importance of maintaining the progress that we have made around supporting people of color into housing and to retain that housing. There also continues to be, as you can imagine, an emphasis on not losing shelter capacity and on sustaining supportive housing capacity, just given the vulnerability of the folks who are being served there. So we had the guidance we had this year, built a budget. What you see here is an overall summary of the proposed budget for the joint office, and this is the combined budget, includes both the county funding and the city funding, as well as some federal funds, some state funds, and other funds. The budget would be, as proposed, about $80 million. $3 million in new city requests, and they're listed here, and we'll get to each of them individually as we go through the different pieces of this. I'm happy to pause there if you had any questions that were about any of the elements of this particular slide.
So is the Visitor Development Fund new this year?
Aspects of it, yes. So that is a fund that has some holdover from a real estate sale in it, some carryover funding for supportive housing, and then it is the new allocation of Visitors Development Fund that we anticipate starting to collect in this coming fiscal year. So that's about $2.5 million projected.
So it's 2.5 million new dollars, not 4.3 million new dollars?
It's 2.5 new dollars, which is the beginning of that getting to $5 million annually agreement. So,
and so with new dollars, do you have the ability to move some additional dollars so that you can pay for your outreach coordinator person?
So right now, the anticipation is that these resources are going towards the.
Specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there is some ramp-up money that's going to come in. These dollars will ultimately be attached to long-term supportive housing projects principally. And so we do have some flexibility in the first couple of years, and we're expected to invest those dollars towards that target population for these funds, so. So going through our administration, this is our entire office operations, about $2.7 million. So we'll have, as proposed, about 33 FTE in the office. We continue to put about 92% of the funding that comes to our office out into the community in contracts. In terms of city and county funding, we just have the one new position that's proposed in the budget. It's a split between the city and the county. It's the community engagement position. Safety off the streets is our second biggest item of investment. Last year, we served about 6,360 unique individuals in shelter. I will say that that number is down, not insignificantly from the year before. That is largely because the lengths of stay in shelter have gone up significantly. On the family side, we've seen lengths of stay go from as short as 9 days average in FY17 to over 115 days now. And then on the adult side, we've seen the lengths of stay in FY17. They were 27 days, and last year we were at 53 days. So as the number of days that people spend in shelter grow, the number of people who can use a shelter in a given year goes down. We did have some transition last year in terms of overall family shelter capacity because we were moving out of that family center. Then we had folks in motels, and now we're back to full capacity on the family shelter side with the 2 new family shelters. You'll see there that 49% of the people served in our shelters were people of color, and some statements about our overall capacity. It was an important year last year, opening a number of new shelters that were purpose-built, that have enhanced services in them, so we continue to make that transition both on the family side and the adult side. Coming up this year, we are, and you'll see the capital request for one-time funding for $2.2 million. Is largely geared toward realizing our commitment to create a new year-round, high-quality shelter in North or Northeast, and a replacement high-quality shelter for women in the downtown area with the closure of safes. And then we have currently the SOS shelter, which we'd like to transition women out of. So those are 2 big projects on the congregate shelter side, and then we have some work we're doing in St. John's around the St. John's Village, which also will be happening this year, and then some discussions about additional alternative shelter options that we may want to pursue.
So, Mark, I just want to be clear for the record. Nothing in what you just said has anything to do with Wapato or whatever they're calling it today.
Nope.
Thank you very much.
Nope.
Just want to make sure that's on the record. Thank you.
Keep asking as long as
Every time you come, yes, and ask for new money, I will ask that question. Thank you.
So this is where you see the proposed investment in Trans-Pacific Services. There's an active discussion with leadership in the trans community around what these dollars should go towards. So we're trying not to get ahead of that conversation. But it does show up as a resource that the community can do some planning around and make some recommendations around how to invest. And then the alternative shelter request here is around the operations for St. John's and support for potential additional alternative shelter.
So obviously the coronavirus has come upon us since the budget was developed. And I know that you're in the beginnings of figuring out next steps on that. Is there likely to be an additional budget ask?
Commissioner, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we made an initial round of requests, which we got support for. So it's allowing us to take this first couple of months of expanded resources for outreach and motel vouchering. And so I think we're working with our emergency management folks to understand, in the event that we need a different kind of facility, additional facilities, what's the cost structure for that? How much would we need to ask for? Where would we ask for it? There's a lot of conversation about resources from the state. Maybe there's resources that can be reimbursed from the federal government. So right now we're in that phase of trying to cost it out and frankly really understand how we would staff it, because one of the principal sort of challenges of any expansion right now, given what's happening to folks who are having to step out of work for periods of time, is just maintaining the staffing capacity of all of our providers to continue to do the services we have, and then think about what would happen if we needed to try to expand that.
And when do you anticipate the motel vouchers for especially vulnerable people to be available?
Well, so we've already authorized our shelter providers and the housing placement organizations that may have people in shelter that they're working with to begin motel vouchering. So the process has already begun, but it's not a standalone program. It's not a new program with new staffing that can motel voucher folks. A motel voucher is good. It provides a space, but we also have to ensure that when someone moves into a motel voucher, they have a person who can visit them and make sure they're getting food and those types of things. And at the moment, we're having to look to our current providers and their staffing to provide that kind of support. So we're having these one-on-one conversations with our providers saying, how much staff capacity can you allocate to this without undermining your other services? We've authorized them to pay for temp work. We've authorized them to pay for overtime. But we're really needing to look to them because we can't offer them new staff people, right? That's not quickly something we can do. So as we move into this moteling space, that's how that's having to unfold just by virtue of the realities of the resource constraints that we have on the staffing side.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I absolutely think that we're going to be getting some requests for additional money based on just the activities that are starting to take place and the plans that we're putting in place. Mike Myers, who, as you know, is the director of the Bureau of Emergency Management, has been leading the effort, working every single day with all the other stakeholders to actually come up with protocol. And so every morning at 9, they're on the phone. They're talking a few times a day. Today is another big moment to make sure that we're putting those contingency plans in place. And so we'll continue to expect that there will be requests that will be very specific to the immediate needs that people are actually addressing right now.
I mean, I'm also really concerned with this. I've been talking to people at the state and federal level, and in the middle of this session, actually organizing with my apartment complex for how we're going to support each other and keep our building as safe as we can. I just want to quickly say, I think your kind of prioritization of different populations is right on. I want to appreciate how deep the racial equity work has been in the joint office, and I also appreciate the new focus on homeless trans community members. And I want to ask you another hard question. This 29,865 units that we're short on for extremely low income families, I would like to know a cost.
So I think the important thing to clarify on that number is that those are units that have rents that are currently affordable to someone who is making 30% or less of the area median income. So it doesn't, we have many people making 30% who are paying 50% of their income towards
Yes.
rent, or 60 or 70, right? So, we could probably come up with a sort of back of the napkin number that would say, how much would we have to buy down the rents on all of in order to meet that need? We know that the Housing Authority, I haven't checked with them, but they have an average annual spend per voucher, Section 8 voucher, and it's historically, I think, been in the sort of 8,000 to 10,000 range. Please don't quote me on that, but it's like in that ballpark. So if you think, okay, well, if you needed to buy down market rents for whatever this is, 28,000 people,
30,000,
you start
yeah.
to think, you start to get into the scale of the number. There are lots of ways in which that's imperfect, but it's not a small number, certainly, that you would need, even if all you were doing was buying down the rent and didn't have to build any new inventory. If you then think about, well, how many of those units would you also need to find the capital for to build, the number grows too. So.
It's another, I think we need to come to grips with the scope of the scale and the fact that we can't solve this on our own. We need the federal government to step up and take some pretty huge actions. So, thanks.
So I think folks are getting ready to leave. Did you have any questions that you wanted to make sure? Okay. So we've got our supportive housing side. I'll just jump forward before everybody leaves. The diversion employment. We added a few quotes. If you have time, take a look at them. I mean, some of these programs are doing such exceptional work in our community, and these are some testimonials of people or specific experiences that people have had in these programs. We talk a lot about numbers. This is transforming people's life experience and creating real opportunity for tens of thousands of people in our community. So I don't want that to get lost in these kind of budget discussions, and so just tried to pull a little bit of that kind of information out. So Director Branham talked about risks. This is sort of our risk slide. I will say that, I mean, raising COVID, the risk profile of our community right now of people experiencing homelessness is completely different, and that's a whole separate conversation. And just know that, like, we've got right now resources in our office full on dedicated to figuring out how to be responsive and what we can do within our resources, and talking to public health every day and convening all of our providers, twice a week in the morning and anytime providing technical assistance. So that side of the risk, we're trying to do everything we can on. For us, obviously, the one-time funding that is in our budget, that's over $7 million this year, is fundamental to the sustenance of this system of care that we've built. And so this slide really just provides you examples of kind of what we're currently buying in terms of system capacity. For some reason, this resource was not to continue. We'd have to go back and unwind a whole bunch of things to figure out where exactly we took the reductions. But this is a fundamental component of our basic system capacity, and on the shelter side, the housing placement side, supportive housing. So this for us is a big piece of what we understand to be risk, right? Because we understand that one-time funding and ongoing resources are scarce. So that's that we wanted to share with you again.
And Mark, am I to understand that we would be sharing the cost of the community engagement coordinator with the county?
Yeah. It's
So
proposed.
you're asking us to pay half?
Yeah, and the Trans-Pacific Services is actually a $500,000 request, $250 to the county, $250 to the city. And I think those are the only joint requests. Looking at Christian, yeah. So real quickly, our priorities for next year. I mentioned, Commissioner, the culturally specific services investments on the adult side is a big focus. We continue to be doing a Home for Everyone strategic planning, although with the prospect of Here Together, we're having to rethink our internal capacity to do planning. So should that measure pass, there's going to be a lot of planning we need to do internally with our county partners and with our regional partners. So that will, should it pass, be a significant thing for us. And then I think we've spoken about the safety off the streets issues. And frankly, we will, and we're building out the capacity in our office to support this permanent supportive housing expansion. The VDF funds are an important new allocation of resource for the Portland bond projects. We're talking about the Metro funds with PHB. So I expect next year to be a continued sort of ramping up of the expansion of PSH in our community, and a number of projects will start to open, and we'll be working closely with PHB on that side of things. I think I've gone quickly. The last is the decision points, and these are just our budget requests that we've, I think, outlined already. So any additional questions?
No questions, just a comment. I always like to thank agencies when they do something that is beneficial, and Mark and I have talked before, but the fact that the joint board now is collaborating with our school district's homeless liaison, so they can capture really people. We have families that never have connected with a nonprofit agency that they've worked with, so this is a way that we can capture more of that homeless population that doesn't get in the numbers.
Mark, I'm curious as to what an alternative shelter is.
It can be, in the way that we think about it, any shelter that isn't a sort of a traditional congregate shelter. Often it could be the village model, for example. So the Kenton Women's Village is an alternative shelter. The St. John's Village will be an alternative shelter.
Okay.
It expands the concept of shelter beyond what we often think of the 100-bed kind of facility.
Thank you. Any other questions? I just want to thank you both very much. Thank your department. Clearly, the work that you're doing is pretty transformational. And I certainly understand the challenges that come along with trying to take care of some of our most vulnerable people in our community. And so I applaud the hard work, and I appreciate what you're doing. And since today we're not making budget decisions, we don't have to actually say anything on the record about what that will be like. But let me just say that I appreciate the expansion and the acknowledgement that trans youth are some of the most underserved people in our community, and we're going to start correcting that oversight. If there's nothing else for the good of the order, we are adjourned.
Thank you all very much. And I'll just say a thank you to everybody in the joint office and all of our partners at the city for being part of this work. So thank you.
It's a team effort, no doubt. None of us can do it alone.